Hello there and welcome to Secretum Histories. Tonight, we are stepping into a subject that has lingered at the edge of ancient memory for thousands of years, a subject that has been reinterpreted, exaggerated, misunderstood, and sometimes deliberately reshaped depending on the era and the expectations of those doing the reading. We are not here to rush. We are not here to announce conclusions. We're here to listen carefully to what the oldest traditions suggest when they speak about cycles in the sky, and what happens when those cycles reach what is described, again and again, as a final phase. The idea of Nibiru, as it exists in modern conversation, often arrives already loaded with fear or spectacle. Images of fiery collisions, rogue planets tearing through the solar system, sudden destruction, and dramatic endings tend to dominate the imagination. But the earliest sources that are associated with this concept do not speak in those terms. They do not describe panic. They do not describe surprise. They do not describe a single catastrophic moment that arrives without precedent. Instead, they speak slowly, cautiously, and often indirectly about repetition, timing, and return. They frame change not as an explosion, but as a process that unfolds according to patterns that were already known long before the event itself. Before we go any further, take a moment to settle in. If the day has been long, allow it to loosen its grip. This is not information meant to be consumed quickly. It was not written quickly when it first appeared, and it was not preserved quickly either. These ideas survived because they were copied, recited, and remembered across generations, who believed that certain patterns were worth carrying forward, even if their meaning was not always fully understood. If you find this kind of exploration calming or meaningful, you already know what to do. Support the channel in the way that feels right to you, and then, without hurry, let the story continue. When ancient traditions speak about a returning body in the sky, they do not frame it as an invasion. They do not frame it as an interruption. They frame it as something expected, something accounted for, something that belongs to a larger order that does not revolve around human preference or convenience. The sky, in these traditions, is not a chaotic space filled with random motion. It is a system governed by timing, repetition, and balance. What returns does so because it has returned before. The language used in the earliest records that later became associated with Nibiru does not emphasize drama. It emphasizes position, role, and function. It describes a marker rather than a menace, a reference point rather than a weapon. This distinction matters because it shapes how we interpret what a final phase actually means. A final phase is not necessarily an end in the sense of destruction. It is an end in the sense of completion, the closing of a loop that has already been in motion for a very long time. In the oldest cosmological frameworks of Mesopotamia, the sky was understood as layered and structured. Objects in the heavens were not simply lights. They were participants in a system that regulated time, seasons, authority, and order. Some stars marked planting cycles, others marked ritual calendars. Certain movements were associated with the rise and fall of kingship, the legitimacy of rule, and the stability of cities. Nothing moved without meaning, but that meaning was rarely immediate or obvious. Nibiru, in its earliest context, appears as a term connected to crossing, transition, or passage. Not arrival from elsewhere, but movement within an established system. It was associated with thresholds rather than destinations. This is why later traditions sometimes struggled to define it precisely. A threshold is not a thing you stay on. It is a moment you pass through. Its importance lies in what it connects, not in what it destroys. When ancient scribes recorded celestial cycles, they did so with an awareness that human lifespans were short compared to the rhythms they were observing. A full cycle could exceed a single lifetime. Sometimes it could exceed many. This meant that knowledge had to be inherited rather than experienced firsthand. It also meant that the meaning of a cycle's final phase was rarely tied to personal survival. It was tied to continuity, memory, and adjustment. The final phase, as described in various fragments and later interpretations that preserve earlier ideas, is not portrayed as sudden. It is portrayed as a narrowing, a slowing, a point at which patterns converge and certain conditions reach saturation. When something reaches saturation, change becomes unavoidable, but that change does not need to be violent to be profound. In these traditions, cycles exist to maintain balance, not to punish. When balance drifts too far in one direction, the system corrects itself. This correction is not framed as moral judgment. It is framed as maintenance. Just as rivers flood not out of anger, but because of accumulation, cycles close not out of malice, but because their function has been fulfilled. One of the most overlooked aspects of the final phase descriptions is how little attention is given to spectacle. There are no detailed visual accounts of destruction. There are no dramatic narratives of fire falling from the sky. Instead, there are references to silence, to pauses in record keeping, to changes in language, to shifts in how authority is described. These are subtle signals, but they are consistent. When a cycle reaches its final phase, the text suggests that the most significant changes do not occur in the sky. They occur in how humans organize themselves beneath it. Kingship changes hands. Lineages break. Cities lose prominence while others rise. Knowledge is condensed, simplified, or sealed away. Writing styles shift. What was once elaborately explained becomes briefly referenced, as if the audience no longer requires the full context. This pattern appears repeatedly across long spans of time, not once, not twice, but often enough that it becomes difficult to dismiss as coincidence. Each time, the end of a cycle is associated with transition rather than obliteration. Something concludes so that something else can begin operating under a slightly different set of assumptions. Importantly, the texts do not present these transitions as optional. They are not negotiated. They are not announced in advance to the general population. Those who observe the sky may anticipate them, but anticipation does not equal control. The cycle does not stop because it is inconvenient. It does not accelerate because it is feared. The final phase is often described indirectly, through what stops happening rather than what begins. Certain rituals fall out of use. Certain gods receive fewer mentions. Certain roles lose definition. Silence appears where explanation once existed. This is one of the most telling signs that a cycle is closed. When explanation is no longer required, it is often because the framework that made it necessary has shifted. Another recurring theme is restraint. If the final phase were intended to erase humanity, the texts would likely say so. Ancient cultures were not shy about recording catastrophe when they believed it occurred. Floods, famines, invasions, and collapses are described vividly elsewhere. The absence of such language in descriptions tied to cyclical completion suggests a different intention. Instead of destruction, the emphasis is on limitation. Lifespans shorten, authority fragments, memory becomes less precise. The world continues, but under new constraints. This aligns with a worldview in which cycles regulate excess rather than eliminate existence. It is also worth noting that these traditions rarely frame humanity as the central concern. The cycle does not revolve around human comfort or suffering. Humans are affected by it, certainly, but they are not the axis upon which it turns. This perspective alone sets these texts apart from modern interpretations that place humanity at the centre of cosmic drama. When the final phase arrives, according to these ancient frameworks, it does not announce itself with fear. It passes quietly, leaving behind traces that only make sense when viewed across generations. Those living through it may not realise what is happening. Those born afterward inherit a world that feels normal to them, unaware that its parameters have subtly changed. This is why later cultures often remember that something happened without remembering exactly what. Myths become compressed. Numbers become symbolic. Events that once unfolded gradually are remembered as singular moments, The cycle remains, but its edges blur. The idea of Nibiru reaching a final phase, when stripped of modern embellishment, does not point to annihilation, it points to recalibration. It suggests that systems, whether celestial or social, do not run indefinitely without adjustment. When adjustment is required, it arrives according to timing that does not depend on belief. As we move forward, it becomes increasingly important to separate what the oldest traditions actually imply from what later generations projected onto them. The fear-driven narratives are recent. The quiet, methodical descriptions are ancient, and it is those ancient patterns that will guide the rest of this exploration as we continue, slowly and carefully, into what these cycles were believed to govern, and why their endings were never described as the end of everything. The reason ancient texts speak in terms of cycles rather than endings begins with how time itself was understood in the earliest civilizations. Time was not perceived as a straight line moving from a beginning toward a final conclusion. It was perceived as something that repeated, adjusted, and renewed itself through recognizable patterns. This understanding did not come from philosophy alone, it came from direct observation of the natural world. Rivers flooded and receded, seasons returned, stars rose and fell in predictable sequences. Generations were born, aged, and died, while the land itself remained. Nothing appeared to move toward a permanent stop. Everything moved toward repetition with variation. In early Mesopotamian thought, time was embedded in the rhythms of the environment. The agricultural calendar depended on repetition. Planting followed harvest. Harvest followed flooding. Flooding followed snowmelt far to the north. If time had been perceived as a one-directional march toward an end, planning would have been impossible. Survival required confidence that the world would return to a familiar state after disruption. That confidence shaped how history, cosmology, and divine action were recorded. Because of this, the language used in ancient texts avoids finality. An ending implies termination. It implies that what comes next is nothing. That idea did not align with observed reality. Even catastrophic events such as floods or the collapse of cities did not result in emptiness. They resulted in rebuilding, migration, and reorganization. From the perspective of those recording these events, destruction was not the end of the world. It was the end of a particular arrangement of the world. This distinction is critical. Ancient scribes were not interested in whether something stopped existing altogether. They were interested in whether order persisted, whether authority remained legitimate, and whether the relationship between humans, land, and the divine continued to function. When those relationships shifted, they recorded a change in cycle, not an ending. Another reason cycles dominate ancient narratives is the scale at which these cultures thought. Many of the processes they described extended far beyond a single human life. Dynasties rose and fell across centuries. Religious traditions evolved across millennia. Celestial movements completed full patterns over spans of time that no individual observer could witness in full. Writing allowed continuity of observation, but it did not compress time into human-scale conclusions. When something cannot be fully observed within one lifetime, it resists being framed as an ending. Instead, it becomes part of an ongoing sequence that must be inherited rather than concluded. This is why ancient texts often emphasize transmission. Knowledge is passed down, rituals are maintained, observations are copied. The future is not imagined as a final chapter, but as another turn in a pattern already in motion. The concept of cycles also served a stabilizing social function. If time is cyclical, then collapse is survivable. It may be devastating, but it is not absolute. This belief allowed societies to endure hardship without interpreting it as cosmic abandonment. Floods, droughts, invasions, and political upheaval could be understood as phases rather than failures of the universe itself. Endings imply judgment. Cycles imply necessity. Ancient cosmologies tended to favor necessity. Events occurred because conditions required them. not because of moral verdicts against humanity. Even when divine displeasure is invoked, it is often framed as irritation, imbalance, or overload rather than ethical condemnation. Noise becomes too great. Labour becomes unsustainable. Order requires adjustment. This perspective removes the urgency to explain everything in terms of final consequences. Instead, it emphasises maintenance. The world requires management. When management fails, correction follows. Correction restores function, even if it does so harshly. Cycles also allowed ancient cultures to integrate contradiction. A god could destroy and preserve. A flood could annihilate cities and renew fertility. A king could be both chosen by heaven and later removed by it. These contradictions do not resolve cleanly in linear narratives. They fit naturally within cyclical ones. Another important factor is how memory was preserved. Writing was expensive and labour-intensive. Clay tablets took time to prepare, inscribe, dry and store. Not everything could be recorded in full detail. Scribes selected what mattered most for continuity. They prioritised patterns over isolated incidents. A single disaster mattered less than the recurring conditions that produced it. By recording cycles, scribes created templates that future generations could apply to their own circumstances. A famine was not unique. It was part of a known sequence. A political collapse was not unprecedented. It followed earlier ones. This approach made history useful rather than merely descriptive. Cycles also reduce the need for prediction. If time is cyclical, the future resembles the past, even if it does not replicate it exactly. This allowed societies to prepare without claiming certainty. They could recognize signs without insisting on dates. They could acknowledge transition without needing to define its endpoint. In contrast, endings require precision. They require explanation. They demand justification. Ancient texts avoid this burden by refusing to frame events as terminal. Even when describing total destruction, such as the wiping away of an earlier world, they almost immediately turn to what follows. Survivors rebuild. New rules are established. Boundaries are redrawn. This habit of narration reflects a worldview in which existence itself is durable, even when forms within it are not. Cities fall, languages change, gods merge or fade. But the structure of reality persists. Cycles ensure continuity without stagnation. The language of cycles also reflects humility. Ancient cultures did not assume they were living at the climax of history. They did not believe they were uniquely positioned at the edge of cosmic significance. They saw themselves as participants in processes that began long before them and would continue long after they were gone. This humility contrasts sharply with later interpretations that seek dramatic conclusions. End-of-the-world narratives place the present at the centre of cosmic attention. Cyclical narratives decentralize the present. They remind the listener that the world has endured many phases and will endure many more. The choice to speak of cycles rather than endings also shaped how authority was understood. Kingship was not eternal. It descended, functioned, and eventually withdrew. Divine favour was not permanent. It moved according to conditions. This prevented absolute power from claiming final legitimacy. When a king fell, it did not mean the gods had vanished. It meant the cycle of rule had turned. Another ruler would arise. Another city would gain prominence. This understanding provided continuity even amid instability. In cosmological terms, cycles allowed ancient thinkers to reconcile change with permanence. The sky could change its configuration without losing its structure. The earth could flood without dissolving. Humanity could suffer without ceasing to exist. Endings threaten identity. Cycles preserve it. The repeated emphasis on cycles also reflects a practical limitation of early science. Without modern instruments, ancient observers relied on long-term patterns. They tracked stars across generations. They noted planetary movements over centuries. They inferred large cycles from partial data. This naturally led to cautious language. Instead of declaring final outcomes, They described tendencies. Instead of asserting conclusions, they marked transitions. Precision was replaced by pattern recognition. When later interpreters imposed linear frameworks onto these texts, misunderstandings followed. Words associated with transition were read as destruction. Markers were read as threats. Completion was read as annihilation. These interpretations say more about modern expectations than ancient intent. In the ancient worldview, the most dangerous assumption was that something would not return. The stability of agriculture, ritual and governance depended on return. The sun returned. The rivers returned. The gods returned in festivals and offerings. If return ceased, existence itself would unravel. Therefore, endings were avoided not because they were unthinkable, but because they were unnecessary. Even the most extreme disruptions were framed as temporary within a larger order. This perspective also influenced how celestial events were interpreted. Rare alignments, unusual movements, and long cycles were noted carefully, but they were not assumed to herald final catastrophe. They were understood as signals that a phase was completing and another would follow. The final phase of a cycle in this context is not a cliff. It is a narrowing passage. Conditions change, options reduce, structures simplify. What cannot be sustained falls away. What can endure is carried forward. This is why ancient texts often focus on preservation rather than escape. Seeds are saved. Knowledge is condensed. Lineages are protected. These actions make sense in a cyclical framework. They would be irrational in an ending framework. Endings demand survival at all costs. Cycles demand continuity of function. The difference is subtle but profound. As we continue moving through this exploration, it becomes increasingly clear that ancient cultures did not fear cycles. They relied on them. They built their calendars, their myths, and their institutions around the assumption that change was inevitable but not final. The world would adjust as it always had, and those who understood its rhythms would recognize the signs not as warnings of extinction, but as indications that one phase was quietly giving way to another. The word Nibiru did not begin its life as a name for a planet, a threat, or a harbinger of catastrophe. In its earliest appearances, it functioned as a technical term embedded within a much larger system of celestial language that was precise, practical, and context-dependent. To understand what it originally meant, it is necessary to step away from later assumptions and return to how ancient Mesopotamian scribes actually used words when they described the sky. In Sumerian and later Akkadian traditions, celestial terminology was not poetic in the modern sense. It was functional. Words were chosen to describe position, motion, role, and relationship rather than essence or origin. The sky was treated as a structured space governed by order, not as an abstract realm of mystery. Objects in that space were defined by what they did and where they appeared, not by what they were imagined to be in isolation. Nibiru belongs firmly to this category. Its root meaning is associated with crossing, passage, or transition. It is a word that describes an act or a function rather than a fixed object. In this sense, it is closer to a verb than a noun, even when it is used as a label. It indicates a point at which something crosses from one domain into another, or a moment when a boundary is traversed. This is why Nibiru appears in different contexts across different texts. It is not consistently attached to a single body in the sky. Sometimes it is associated with a particular star, sometimes with a planet, sometimes with a point along the celestial path where movements change direction or significance. This variability is not a problem in the original framework, it is expected. A crossing point is not always occupied by the same traveller. Ancient Mesopotamian astronomy did not operate on the assumption that names permanently belong to objects. Names belong to roles. When a celestial body fulfilled a particular role within a cycle, it could be described using the term that corresponded to that role. When it no longer fulfilled that role, the term no longer applied. This is fundamentally different from modern astronomical naming conventions, where a name is permanently assigned to a physical object regardless of context. Applying modern expectations to ancient language creates confusion where none originally existed. In the earlier sources, Nibiru is often associated with moments of transition in the sky. These transitions could involve the crossing of the celestial equator, the movement of a planet between regions of the sky governed by different deities, or the point at which a celestial path intersected with another. The emphasis is always on movement and threshold. The sky, in Mesopotamian thought, was divided into regions that mirrored political and divine order on Earth. Certain zones belonged to specific gods. When a celestial body moved from one zone into another, it was not merely changing position, it was changing jurisdiction. That change mattered. It carried implications for timekeeping, ritual, and interpretation. Nibiru functioned as a marker for such moments. It was not the traveller, it was the crossing itself, or the designation applied to the traveller while it was performing the act of crossing. This is why later texts sometimes refer to Nibiru in connection with Marduk, the chief god of Babylon, and sometimes in connection with Jupiter. Jupiter, as the brightest and most dominant planet visible to the naked eye, often served as the celestial representative of supreme authority. When Jupiter occupied certain positions, particularly those associated with transition or regulation, it could be described as Nibiru in that context. This does not mean that Jupiter was Nibiru in an absolute sense. It means that Jupiter was fulfilling the role denoted by the term at that moment. When it moved on, the designation no longer applied. In other contexts, Nibiru appears connected to stars or constellations that marked seasonal or calendrical shifts. Again, the emphasis is not on identity but on function. The sky was a clock, and Nibiru was one of the markers used to read it. This functional approach explains why ancient texts do not describe Nibiru as arriving from elsewhere. There is no language of invasion or intrusion. There is no suggestion that it enters the system from outside. It is always described within an already ordered sky, performing a task that the system requires. The idea of Nibiru as an external body entering the solar system is entirely absent from early sources. That concept depends on a modern imagination that equates crossing with arrival and transition with disruption. In the ancient framework, crossing was expected. Transition was necessary. Without it, order would fail. Another critical point is that ancient scribes did not speculate freely. Their texts were conservative. They preserved established knowledge rather than inventing new cosmologies. When they used a term like Nibiru repeatedly and consistently in technical contexts, it indicates that its meaning was stable within that framework, even if it appears ambiguous to modern readers. The ambiguity arises only when the original framework is removed. Once Nibiru is extracted from its role-based system and treated as a proper noun referring to a single hidden object, its original meaning collapses under expectations it was never designed to meet. Modern interpretations often rely on the assumption that ancient people were encoding secret information about physical objects that modern science has not yet discovered. This assumption misunderstands the purpose of ancient astronomical texts. They were not speculative, they were practical. They existed to regulate ritual calendars, agricultural timing, and political legitimacy. A hidden planet that appeared once every few thousand years and caused global catastrophe would not have been useful for these purposes. A crossing point that marked predictable transitions would. This is why Nibiru is often mentioned in connection with order rather than chaos. It is associated with regulation, balance, and the maintenance of structure. In Babylonian cosmology, Marduk's role was to establish and maintain order after chaos had been subdued. When Nibiru is linked to Marduk, it reflects this regulatory function. In this context, Nibiru is sometimes described as fixing the bounds of heaven and earth. This phrase has been widely misinterpreted. It does not mean physically holding the sky in place. It means maintaining the boundaries that define cosmic order. Boundaries in ancient thought were conceptual as much as spatial. They defined what belonged where and when. Fixing boundaries was a recurring theme in Mesopotamian cosmology. Rivers had boundaries, cities had walls, temples had sacred precincts. The sky too had divisions that needed to be respected. Nibiru, as a crossing marker, helped define those divisions by marking when transitions occurred. It is also important to note that Nibiru is never described as permanent. Permanence belongs to structure, not to markers. A boundary crossing exists only at the moment it is crossed. This transience is central to its meaning. Later interpretations that treat Nibiru as a stable, massive planet with a long orbit misunderstand this entirely. Such an object would not be a crossing, it would be a resident. The term does not support that idea linguistically or conceptually. The confusion deepened when later readers began treating mythological language as coded science. When metaphors and functional descriptions were reinterpreted as literal physics, the original coherence of the system was lost. Ancient scribes were not attempting to hide knowledge from future generations. They were attempting to preserve it accurately for their own. The complexity of their astronomical systems reflects careful observation, not secretive intent. Nibiru's original meaning fits cleanly within this system. It does not require speculative additions. It does not demand missing planets or suppressed knowledge. It operates as a logical component of a sky-based framework that prioritizes predictability over surprise. This also explains why fear is absent from the original usage. Crossings were anticipated. They were accounted for in calendars and omens. A crossing that caused destruction would not be a useful marker. It would invalidate the system. Instead, the final phase of a cycle associated with Nibiru would have been understood as the completion of a regulatory process. Something that had been moving according to order reached the point where its role concluded. The emphasis would be on adjustment, not catastrophe. The later transformation of Nibiru into a symbol of doom reflects a shift in worldview rather than a recovery of ancient truth. Modern culture is oriented toward endings. It seeks climactic conclusions. Ancient culture was oriented toward continuity. When ancient language is filtered through modern expectations, meaning is distorted. Words that once described process are recast as objects. Terms that once indicated function are treated as identity. Understanding what Nibiru originally meant requires undoing that distortion. It requires returning the word to its original environment, where it functioned quietly, precisely, and without drama. In that environment, Nibiru was not a threat waiting to return. It was a moment within a system that assumed return as a rule. It marked when something crossed, when order shifted slightly, when balance was adjusted. As the narrative continues, this original meaning becomes increasingly important. Without it, later discussions of cycles, final phases, and transitions become unanchored. With it, the ancient texts regain coherence. The sky, as these cultures understood it, did not deliver endings. It delivered signals. Nibiru was one of those signals. Not a body arriving from the dark, but a marker that told those watching that a phase had completed, and another was already quietly taking its place. Long before glass lenses were shaped and aligned, long before metal tubes were pointed toward the night sky, the heavens were read through patience rather than magnification. Observation was not an occasional activity. It was a continuous practice woven into daily life, ritual, and survival. The sky was not something distant or abstract. It was immediate, present, and authoritative. Every change mattered because every change could signal something that affected life on the ground. Ancient observers did not attempt to see farther than their eyes allowed. Instead, they learned to see more accurately within those limits. Precision did not come from zooming in. It came from repetition. The same horizon was watched night after night. The same stars were tracked across seasons. Movements were noted not in isolation but in relation to one another. Over time, patterns emerged that were stable enough to rely on. This method required discipline. It demanded restraint. A single, unusual night meant little on its own. Meaning only appeared when deviation persisted or aligned with other signs. Ancient sky readers understood this instinctively. They did not jump to conclusions, they waited. The sky was divided into regions, each associated with specific qualities and responsibilities. These divisions were not arbitrary. They reflected how celestial bodies moved relative to the Earth's axis, the horizon, and the seasonal cycle. The heavens were mapped not as a static chart, but as a living system whose behaviour unfolded over time. Stars that rose just before dawn at certain times of year became markers for agricultural activity. When a particular star appeared in the east shortly before sunrise, it was time to prepare fields. When it disappeared into the glare of the sun weeks later, it was time to harvest. These observations were reliable because they repeated. Their authority came from consistency, not mystery. Planets were treated differently from stars because they behaved differently. Stars held their positions relative to one another. Planets wandered. This wandering did not go unnoticed. It was tracked carefully, because anything that deviated from the fixed order of the sky demanded interpretation. The word planet itself comes from a term meaning wanderer. Ancient observers recognized that these bodies moved against the background of fixed stars. They did not assume randomness. They assumed intention or function. Movement without meaning was not a category that fit their worldview. To read the heavens, ancient cultures relied on alignment. They watched how planets entered and exited constellations. They noted when a planet slowed, stopped, and reversed direction in what is now called retrograde motion. These moments were not treated as anomalies. They were expected phases within larger cycles. Retrograde motion, in particular, played a significant role in interpretation. A planet that appeared to halt and move backward disrupted expectation without breaking order. It signalled reconsideration, delay, or adjustment. These interpretations were not invented casually. They emerged from generations of correlation between celestial behaviour and terrestrial outcomes. If a king began a campaign during a certain planetary configuration and failed repeatedly under similar configurations, the pattern was remembered. Over time, such correlations hardened into rules. The heavens became a record of precedent. Reading the sky was not about prediction in the modern sense. It was about orientation. It provided context. It allowed rulers, priests, and communities to situate themselves within a larger temporal framework. The sky did not tell them exactly what would happen. It told them what kind of time they were in. This distinction matters. Ancient sky reading did not promise certainty. It offered guidance. It identified favourable and unfavourable conditions, not guaranteed outcomes. This kept interpretation flexible and prevented contradiction when events unfolded differently than expected. Because telescopes did not exist, observation focused on the naked eye sky. This limited the number of visible objects, but it also simplified interpretation. Only the most prominent bodies mattered. Their visibility made them relevant to everyone, not just specialists. The sun regulated day and season, the moon regulated month and ritual timing. The visible planets regulated longer cycles associated with authority, conflict, fertility, and transition. Each had a role. None existed in isolation. Observation was cumulative. Knowledge was not discovered by a single individual. It was inherited. Records were copied. Oral traditions reinforced written ones. When discrepancies appeared, they were debated and reconciled slowly. The absence of telescopes also meant that the sky was not separated from human experience. Modern astronomy often removes the observer emotionally. Ancient sky reading did the opposite. It integrated observation with meaning. Temples were aligned with celestial events. City gates faced rising points of significant stars. Processional routes mirrored solar paths. Architecture itself became a form of sky reading frozen in stone and brick. This integration ensured continuity. Even if literacy declined, the sky could still be read through built space. The horizon remained. The sun still rose at predictable points. The calendar lived on in ritual movement. Ancient observers also understood limits. They knew that not everything could be seen. They did not speculate wildly about invisible bodies. What could not be observed consistently was not incorporated into the system. This restraint is often misunderstood. It is mistaken for ignorance. In reality, it reflects methodological discipline. Without instruments to verify speculation, they refused to speculate. What they could observe, they observed thoroughly. A planet's brightness changes were noted. Its colour was remarked upon. Its relationship to weather patterns was recorded. Over centuries, these details accumulated into a coherent interpretive system. The sky was read holistically. No single sign was decisive. Meaning emerged from convergence. A planetary crossing mattered more when it coincided with seasonal change, unusual weather, or political instability. This approach prevented overreaction. It also prevented complacency. When multiple signs aligned, attention sharpened. Importantly, sky reading was not democratized. While everyone lived under the same sky, interpretation was mediated by specialists. Priests, scribes, and trained observers maintained records and issued guidance. This specialization preserved consistency. It also limited distortion. Interpretations were conservative. Innovation was slow and often resisted. The goal was not to surprise, it was to maintain order. Unexpected interpretations destabilized authority. Reliable ones reinforced it. This is why celestial knowledge was tied to legitimacy. A ruler who ignored the sky risked appearing disconnected from cosmic order. A ruler who aligned actions with celestial timing appeared sanctioned. The sky then functioned as an external reference that transcended human disagreement. It was stable when politics were not. This gave it authority. Without telescopes, ancient observers compensated by extending time. They watched longer. They recorded more. They trusted repetition over novelty. This extended timescale is essential to understanding cycles. A cycle is only visible when enough time has passed to see repetition. Short attention spans cannot detect cycles. Ancient cultures trained themselves to think beyond individual lives. This training shaped language. Words described phases, not endpoints. Movements were framed as returns, not departures. Even disappearance was temporary. A star that vanished into the sun's glare was expected to return. This expectation structured interpretation. When something did not return as expected, concern arose. That concern was proportional to deviation, not imagination. When later readers approach these texts with modern assumptions, they often project fear into places where ancient observers saw routine. A body crossing the sky was not alarming. It was informative. The heavens were read like a long manuscript written in light. Each night added a line. Each year completed a paragraph. Meaning emerged only when enough text had accumulated. This method fostered patience. It discouraged sensationalism. It rewarded memory. Even dramatic events such as eclipses were integrated into this framework. Eclipses were temporary interruptions. Their timing could be predicted. Their effects were contextualized. An eclipse did not signal the end of the world. It signaled a moment of vulnerability or adjustment. Rituals addressed it. Life continued. This measured response reflects a worldview that trusted order over chaos. The sky could surprise, but it did not betray. Reading the heavens without telescopes required acceptance of limitation. It also required confidence in what could be known. Ancient observers knew the sky well enough to recognize when something was truly unusual. They did not mistake normal variation for threat. This is why claims of hidden planets causing periodic destruction do not align with ancient methods. Such a body would have disrupted patterns too violently to be ignored. It would have been incorporated explicitly. Instead, what we find are careful descriptions of visible movement and its implications. The system is internally consistent. It does not require missing elements to function. The heavens were read as a system that governed timing, not fate. They indicated when conditions changed, not what choices would be made. This distinction allowed human agency to coexist with cosmic order. The sky set the stage. Humans acted within it. As this exploration continues, the ancient method of reading the heavens becomes increasingly important. It provides the foundation for understanding how cycles were recognized, how final phases were identified, and why none of this required fear. The sky was not a weapon aimed at the earth. It was a clock, a boundary map, and a regulator. Those who learned to read it did not expect endings. They expected transitions, and they learned to recognize them long before lenses ever brought distant worlds into view. The difference between a passing sign and a final phase begins with duration. In ancient systems of interpretation, time was the primary filter that separated significance from noise. A passing sign was brief. It appeared, made itself known, and then resolved back into the ordinary rhythm of the sky. A final phase unfolded slowly. It lingered. It reshaped patterns rather than interrupting them. This distinction was not abstract. It was practical, and it was learned through long observation. Ancient observers did not treat every unusual event as meaningful in the same way. The sky was full of variation. Clouds distorted perception. Atmospheric conditions altered brightness. Seasonal changes shifted visibility. These fluctuations were expected. They were accounted for. A passing sign belonged to this category. It was something that stood out momentarily, but did not alter the underlying structure of celestial movement. A final phase, by contrast, was not defined by novelty. It was defined by convergence. Multiple indicators moved toward alignment over extended periods. What changed was not a single position, but the relationships between positions. When those relationships stabilized into a new configuration, it signaled that a cycle was no longer merely continuing. It was concluding its function. This difference mattered because ancient systems were conservative by design. Overinterpretation was dangerous. Acting on a sign that later proved insignificant could destabilize political authority, disrupt ritual order, or undermine trust in the interpretive framework itself. Therefore, restraint was essential. A passing sign did not demand immediate action. It invited attention, but not commitment. It might be recorded, noted, and compared with past occurrences. If it repeated, or if it coincided with other indicators, its significance could be reassessed. Until then, it remained provisional. A final phase did not need urgency because it did not arrive suddenly. Its power came from inevitability rather than surprise. By the time it was recognized as such, its effects were already unfolding. There was no need to announce it loudly. Those trained to observe understood what they were seeing. Ancient texts reflect this difference in tone. Passing signs are often described briefly. They appear in omen lists, catalogued alongside many other possibilities. Their interpretations are conditional. If this happens, then that may follow. The language is cautious and reversible. Descriptions associated with final phases are different. They appear in broader narratives. They are embedded in accounts of transition. They are referenced indirectly, often through consequences rather than causes. Instead of saying that a final phase began, the texts describe what ceased to function as before. This indirect approach is deliberate. A final phase, by definition, marks the exhaustion of an existing pattern. Once exhausted, that pattern no longer explains reality. Language tied to it becomes adequate. The texts respond by shifting emphasis rather than by declaring an ending. Another key difference lies in scope. Passing signs tend to affect specific domains. Weather changes. Individual rulers face difficulty. Localized disruption occurs. These events matter, but they do not reconfigure the entire system. Final phases operate at a systemic level. Authority structures change. Calendrical frameworks are revised. The roles assigned to gods evolve. Entire categories of interpretation lose relevance. These changes cannot be reversed by ritual correction alone. Ancient observers understood this intuitively. They did not expect rituals to stop a final phase. Rituals existed to maintain balance within a cycle, not to preserve a cycle that had completed its function. This distinction helps explain why some texts emphasize preparation, while others emphasize adaptation. Passing signs might prompt appeasement. Offerings are made, decisions are delayed, precautions are taken. The goal is to restore normal function. During a final phase, restoration is not the goal. Transition is. Effort shifts toward preservation of what can endure, rather than defense of what cannot. Knowledge is condensed, practices are simplified, excess is reduced. This shift is visible across many ancient cultures. When a system approaches its limits, complexity declines. This is not decay in the moral sense. It is adaptation to changing conditions. A passing sign does not demand simplification. A final phase often does. The sky itself provides a model for this distinction. A brief alignment of planets might draw attention, but it passes quickly. It leaves no lasting trace in the structure of the heavens. A slow shift in a planet's long-term cycle alters how future alignments will appear. It changes reference points. Ancient astronomy was sensitive to these slow changes. Precession, for example, gradually altered the relationship between stars and seasons. This was not experienced as a sudden event. It was recognized across generations. Its effects accumulated. Such slow changes were understood as final phases of earlier arrangements. When the sky no longer matched inherited expectations, the system had to adjust. New markers replaced old ones. This process did not invalidate previous knowledge, it contextualized it. What had once worked no longer did, not because it was wrong, but because conditions had shifted. Passing signs never forced this kind of recalibration. They fit within existing frameworks. Another important difference lies in predictability. Passing signs are often unpredictable in their appearance and effect. They depend on chance alignments or localized conditions. Final phases are predictable in the sense that they follow completion. Completion does not mean visibility. It means that all necessary conditions for transition have been met. Once met, continuation in the old form becomes increasingly strained. Ancient texts often describe this strain indirectly. They speak of instability, repetition without resolution, or loss of clarity. These are signals that a system is no longer responding as intended. Passing signs do not produce this effect. They resolve. The system absorbs them and continues. Final phases do not resolve within the existing system. They expose its limits. This exposure explains why final phases are often associated with silence in the texts. When interpretation frameworks lose relevance, explanation pauses. New language has not yet formed. Old language no longer applies. This silence has been misread by later interpreters as concealment or loss. In many cases, it reflects transition rather than disappearance. Ancient cultures were comfortable with this ambiguity. They did not feel compelled to explain everything immediately. They allowed time for new patterns to establish themselves. The difference between a passing sign and a final phase is also reflected in how responsibility is assigned. Passing signs often involve divine displeasure, warning, or correction. They suggest that behavior can influence outcome. Final phases rarely frame change as punishment. They frame it as necessity. The gods themselves adjust roles. Authority is redistributed. Responsibility shifts. This distinction removes moral urgency. Final phases are not about fault. They are about timing. Because of this, fear is not emphasized. Fear motivates reaction. Final phases require endurance. Ancient texts that preserve this distinction often appear calm even when describing profound change. The tone is observational rather than alarmist. This calmness has been mistaken for detachment. In reality, it reflects acceptance. Acceptance that cycles do not negotiate. Another practical difference concerns memory. Passing signs are remembered as events. Final phases are remembered as eras. An eclipse might be recorded with a date. A dynasty's decline is remembered as a period. The difference lies in scale. Nibiru-related interpretations suffer when this distinction is ignored. When every mention of transition is treated as a passing sign of disaster, the underlying structure is lost. In the original framework, a crossing associated with Nibiru would not automatically indicate a final phase. It would only do so if it coincided with broader systemic shifts. This reinforces the idea that no single marker defines a final phase. It is defined by accumulation. Ancient observers trusted accumulation more than anomaly. They didn't assign final significance to isolated events. This approach required long-term record keeping. It also required humility. Conclusions could not be drawn quickly. The modern desire for clear triggers and dramatic signs conflicts with this method. It seeks immediacy where ancient systems sought confirmation. Understanding the difference between a passing sign and a final phase restores coherence to ancient narratives. It explains why so much emphasis is placed on repetition, convergence, and adjustment rather than spectacle. It also explains why ancient cultures could endure collapse without interpreting it as cosmic failure. Collapse was understood as the consequence of a phase reaching its limits, not as evidence that the order itself had broken. The sky did not threaten them, it informed them. As this exploration continues, this distinction becomes increasingly important. Without it, cycles collapse into singular events, and meaning collapses into fear. With it, the ancient worldview regains its depth. A passing sign speaks briefly. A final phase speaks through change. One can be ignored without consequence. The other cannot be reversed. Ancient texts learned to tell the difference by watching, waiting, and remembering. That discipline shaped how they wrote, how they ruled, and how they understood their place within time. The difference is not dramatic. It is structural, and it is precisely this quiet, structural difference that allows the rest of the narrative to unfold without endings, without panic, and without the need for final declarations as the cycle continues to move, steadily, toward whatever configuration comes next. The absence of sudden impact or collision in the oldest records is not accidental, and it is not the result of lost information or deliberate omission. It reflects a fundamentally different way of understanding how change occurs in the world and in the sky. Ancient record keepers did not describe reality as a sequence of abrupt, isolated shocks. They described it as a system governed by accumulation, threshold, and release. When change happened, it happened because conditions had been building toward it, not because something arrived without warning. The earliest texts we possess from Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus region, and later from the Eastern Mediterranean all share this underlying assumption. Events that mattered were rarely instantaneous. Even floods, which appear sudden to those caught within them, are framed in the texts as the result of prior imbalance. Rain accumulated, rivers swelled, boundaries failed. The moment of inundation was not the focus. The conditions that made it inevitable were. This mindset extended naturally to how the sky was interpreted. Celestial bodies were not imagined as weapons travelling through space on unpredictable paths. They were understood as components of a regulated system. Their movements were slow, observable, and repeatable. Anything that moved fast enough to strike the Earth without warning would have fallen outside that system, and therefore outside the logic of the cosmology itself. Ancient observers trusted the sky precisely because it did not behave unpredictably. The reliability of celestial cycles was the foundation of calendars, ritual timing, and political legitimacy. If the sky were capable of sudden, violent interruption, it would not have served this role. A system that could end without notice could not be relied upon to govern time. This is why descriptions of the heavens emphasize continuity even when describing disruption. Storms may rage, eclipses may darken the sun, but these events are temporary and cyclical. They do not introduce new bodies into the sky. They do not shatter the order of motion. They resolve. When ancient texts describe destruction, they describe it as terrestrial. Cities collapse, fields fail, societies fracture. The cause is often divine displeasure or imbalance, but the mechanism is familiar. Flooding, drought, famine, warfare. These are extensions of known forces, not invasions by unknown ones. A sudden impact from the sky would have required a new category of explanation. It would have demanded language that described speed, intrusion, and singular catastrophe. Such language is conspicuously absent from the earliest records. This absence is especially striking given how willing ancient texts were to record terror. These cultures did not avoid describing fear or devastation when they believed it occurred. Laments for destroyed cities describe suffering in vivid detail. Flood narratives dwell on chaos and loss. If a cosmic collision had been part of their remembered past or expected future, it would have been recorded with equal intensity. Instead, what we find are descriptions of gradual withdrawal, of silence, of absence. The sky does not crash into the earth. It recedes. It shifts its emphasis. Certain gods become less present. Certain rituals lose urgency. Authority moves. This pattern suggests that the perceived danger was not sudden annihilation, but gradual misalignment. When alignment failed, systems weakened. They did not explode. Another reason collisions are absent from early records lies in how scale was understood. Ancient cultures were keenly aware of proportion. Mountains were immense. Rivers were powerful. The sky was vast. Anything capable of striking the earth from the heavens would have been beyond any known scale of force. Ancient thinkers did not shy away from the idea of overwhelming power. They attributed such power to gods. But even divine power operated within structure. Gods did not act randomly. Their actions were constrained by roles, hierarchies, and precedent. A sudden celestial collision would have implied either chaos at the highest level or a breakdown of divine order. Neither idea fits comfortably within the cosmologies preserved in early texts. Instead, disorder is always localized and contextual. It affects regions, cities, or populations. The framework of the world remains intact. Heaven and earth do not merge violently. They maintain separation. The separation of heaven and earth is one of the foundational acts in Mesopotamian cosmology. It creates space for life to exist. That separation is not portrayed as fragile. It is portrayed as a structural condition of reality. Undermining it through collision would unravel the entire system. This is why transitions are framed as rebalancing rather than breach. The sky regulates. It does not invade. Another important factor is observational continuity. Ancient sky watchers observed the same stars and planets across generations. Their records show remarkable consistency. If an object capable of collision passed through the sky, its effects on planetary motion would have been noticeable long before impact. Ancient astronomy was sensitive to deviation. Retrograde motion was carefully noted. Brightness changes were recorded. Timing shifts mattered. A massive object approaching the Earth would have distorted these patterns well in advance. The absence of such descriptions suggests that no such object was part of their sky. Later interpretations that introduce collision scenarios often rely on modern imagination rather than ancient evidence. They project contemporary fears of extinction events backward onto texts that were not written with those fears in mind. This projection is facilitated by translation choices that emphasize drama where none exists. Words associated with crossing or transition are rendered as arrival. Words associated with adjustment are rendered as destruction. In their original context, these words did not carry that weight. They described process, not catastrophe. The emphasis on cycles reinforces this. A cycle does not culminate in impact. It culminates in completion. Completion may involve loss, but it does not involve surprise. Ancient cultures feared imbalance more than sudden death. Imbalance could spread, it could persist, it could undermine continuity. Sudden death was final but localized. Imbalance threatened everything. This is why texts focus on maintaining order rather than avoiding collision. Rituals are designed to restore balance. Kings are tasked with upholding justice. Offerings sustain divine favor. These actions would be meaningless if annihilation were imminent and unavoidable. The absence of collision narratives also reflects a different relationship with uncertainty. Ancient cultures accepted uncertainty as part of existence. They did not attempt to eliminate it through prediction of ultimate events. They managed it through tradition. By framing change as cyclical and gradual, they made it manageable. People could adapt. Knowledge could be preserved. The world could continue. Sudden impact narratives remove this possibility. They demand either salvation or despair. Ancient texts resist this binary. When later cultures developed apocalyptic traditions, they often did so in periods of extreme social stress. These narratives reflect historical trauma rather than inherited cosmology. The earliest records, by contrast, emerge from cultures actively building order. Their myths reinforce stability. Even when describing catastrophe, they emphasize restoration. This restorative emphasis is incompatible with collision scenarios. A collision leaves nothing to restore. It is also worth noting that ancient myths frequently anthropomorphize forces. Storms are gods, rivers are deities. If a celestial body were to threaten the earth, it would likely have been personified and integrated into the pantheon. No such figure appears in the earliest layers of these traditions. There is no god of impact, no deity of collision, no recurring symbol of descent and destruction from the sky. Instead, descent is associated with authority, observation, or communication. Gods descend to inspect, to teach, or to judge. They do not descend to annihilate the world through physical force. This symbolic language has been misread literally. Descent becomes arrival. Judgment becomes destruction. In reality, descent often refers to attention rather than movement. When gods descend, they take interest. When they withdraw, order weakens. This metaphorical framework does not support collision imagery. Another subtle but important factor is the role of memory. Catastrophic impacts would leave unmistakable physical traces. Ancient cultures were attentive to their landscapes. They recorded unusual formations. They explained ruins. Flood layers appear in archaeology and in text. Earthquakes are remembered. Volcanic eruptions leave scars. There is no corresponding ancient memory of skyborne impact devastation preserved in early records. The silence is meaningful. It suggests that the changes ancient cultures feared were internal to the system, not imposed from outside it. The final phase of a cycle, therefore, was not imagined as an external strike. It was imagined as an internal exhaustion. Resources depleted. Authority lost coherence. Knowledge fragmented. The sky did not fall. It stopped guiding in the same way. This is a quieter fear, but a deeper one. A sky that no longer aligns with inherited understanding leaves societies disoriented. The absence of collision narratives reflects this deeper concern. The danger was not being struck, it was being unmoored. As this exploration continues, this absence becomes a presence in its own right. It tells us what ancient cultures did not expect. It defines the boundaries of their imagination. They expected change, they expected loss, they expected repetition. They did not expect sudden obliteration from above. The oldest records preserve this expectation consistently. When they describe endings of arrangements, not of existence. Heaven remains, earth remains. The relationship between them adjusts. This continuity is the foundation upon which the rest of the narrative rests. Without it, cycles collapse into catastrophe. With it, the ancient worldview maintains coherence. The sky was not a source of random violence, it was a regulator. When regulation failed, the response was not impact but transition. That distinction explains why the oldest records never speak of sudden collision. Such an event would have violated the very logic that allowed those cultures to trust the heavens as the measure of time, order, and continuity. And it is within that trusted framework, not against it, that the idea of a final phase must be understood as the system continues to move, gradually and deliberately, away from one configuration and toward another that has not yet fully revealed its shape. Moments when order is adjusted rather than destroyed appear repeatedly in the oldest records because ancient cultures understood stability as something that required constant correction. Order was not a fixed achievement that, once established, could remain unchanged forever. It was a condition that had to be maintained through balance, limitation, and periodic reconfiguration. When pressure built within a system, the response was not to erase the system, but to reshape it so that it could continue functioning under new conditions. This understanding is visible in how ancient texts describe change at every level of existence. Cities did not vanish because the world ended. They declined because trade routes shifted, rivers changed course, or political authority fractured. Gods did not disappear because belief collapsed. They merged, changed roles, or receded as the structures that supported their worship evolved. Even humanity itself was not wiped away when imbalance grew. Instead, limits were imposed. Adjustment in this framework is not failure. It is correction. The destruction of everything would have represented a breakdown of cosmic management. Adjustment demonstrated that management was still active. One of the clearest examples of this principle appears in how ancient texts handle population growth. When humanity becomes too numerous, too loud, or too disruptive, the response is not annihilation. It is regulation. Lifespans shorten. Fertility becomes unpredictable. Disease and hardship appear as mechanisms that restore equilibrium. These are harsh measures, but they are targeted. They preserve continuity while reducing excess. This logic applies equally to political systems. Kingship in ancient thought is divinely sanctioned but not divinely guaranteed. When a dynasty fails to maintain order, legitimacy withdraws. Another ruler rises. Another city becomes dominant. The institution survives even as its form changes. The destruction of a city when it occurs is not treated as the destruction of civilization itself. Laments mourn the loss intensely, but they also assume rebuilding elsewhere. The grief is real, but it is framed within continuity. Civilization migrates rather than disappears. This pattern reflects a deep trust in structure. Structure may bend, it may crack, but it does not simply vanish. The sky itself provided the primary model for this kind of adjustment. Celestial movements were stable enough to regulate time, yet flexible enough to accommodate long-term change. Precession slowly altered stellar positions. Planetary cycles shifted emphasis over centuries. These changes did not invalidate earlier observations. They required recalibration. Ancient sky readers responded by updating reference points rather than discarding the entire system. New stars became seasonal markers. Old ones faded from importance. The calendar adapted. This willingness to adjust without abandoning order is one of the most consistent features of ancient cosmology. It stands in contrast to later narratives that frame change as total collapse. Adjustment often occurs quietly. Ancient texts rarely dramatize it. Instead, they describe consequences. Rituals change frequency. Offerings change form. Titles lose clarity. Authority becomes diffuse. These are signs that order is being reconfigured rather than destroyed. One reason ancient cultures favored adjustment over destruction is practical. Total destruction leaves no one to inherit memory. Without memory, continuity is impossible. Adjustment preserves memory by allowing those who remember to pass knowledge forward. This emphasis on memory appears repeatedly. Texts stress preservation of names, lineages, and knowledge, even during periods of upheaval. When something must end, what matters is what survives. This survival is not always physical. Sometimes it is symbolic. A god may lose prominence, but their attributes are absorbed into another deity. A city may fall, but its myths travel with refugees. A political system may collapse, but its administrative practices influence successors. Order changes shape, but its core functions persist. Ancient flood narratives illustrate this clearly. The flood is catastrophic, but it is not absolute. One family survives. Animals survive. Knowledge survives. The world resumes under new constraints. The flood adjusts the conditions of existence. It does not erase existence itself. This distinction matters because it reveals how ancient cultures understood crisis. Crisis was not the end of meaning. It was a turning point that required restraint, patience, and adaptation. The gods themselves participate in this adjustment. They debate. They compromise. They redistribute roles. Authority shifts within the divine hierarchy as conditions change. This portrayal of gods as adaptable rather than absolute reinforces the same principle at a higher level. Even divine order is subject to recalibration. Another important aspect of adjustment is scale. Small imbalances produce small corrections. Large imbalances produce systemic ones. The response is proportional, not arbitrary. This proportionality explains why sudden, total destruction is rare in ancient thought. It would be disproportionate to most imbalances described. When texts do describe near-total collapse, it is framed as exceptional, not normative. It is remembered precisely because it breaks the pattern. But even then, continuity reasserts itself afterward. Adjustment also preserves agency. Humans can respond to change. They can migrate, rebuild, reinterpret. Total destruction removes agency entirely. Ancient cultures valued agency even when they emphasized divine control. Humans had roles. They were expected to act within limits. Adjustment allows those roles to continue even if they are altered. This perspective shapes how final phases of cycles are understood. A final phase does not signal erasure. It signals that the current configuration has reached its limit. The response is restructuring. Structures that cannot be sustained fall away. Those that can endure are simplified or reinforced. This process often involves loss. Loss is not minimized in the texts, but it is contextualized. Laments exist because adjustment hurts. They do not exist because the world ends. Another reason adjustment dominates ancient narratives is that these cultures experienced repeated cycles of collapse and recovery. Mesopotamia, in particular, was prone to flooding, salinization of soil, and shifting river courses. Cities rose and fell regularly. If each collapse had been interpreted as final, cultural continuity would have been impossible. Instead, collapse became part of the expected rhythm. This expectation shaped myth. Myths did not promise permanence, they promised return. The idea of return is central. Crops return, rains return, authority returns in new forms. Return does not imply sameness, it implies function. This functional continuity explains why ancient texts are comfortable with ambiguity. Adjustment creates transitional periods where clarity is reduced. The texts reflect this by becoming less specific. Silence increases during transitions. This silence has often been mistaken for loss of knowledge. In many cases, it reflects uncertainty while a new equilibrium forms. Ancient cultures did not rush to fill this silence. They allowed time to resolve it. This patience contrasts sharply with modern interpretations that seek definitive explanations for every gap. Adjustment also appears in how law evolves. Legal codes are updated, penalties change, standards shift. The institution of law remains. Kings claim continuity with predecessors even when systems change. They adopt old titles, invoke old gods, and restore old temples, even as governance adapts. This demonstrates a desire to maintain legitimacy through continuity rather than rupture. When cycles reach a point where adjustment is no longer sufficient, more dramatic change occurs, but even then, the goal is re-establishment, not void. The destruction of an old order creates space for a new one to function. Space is not emptiness, it is potential. Ancient texts understand potential deeply. They frame creation itself as emerging from undifferentiated potential. Destruction returns things closer to that state without fully dissolving them. This framework makes adjustment preferable to obliteration. Obliteration would erase potential, adjustment preserves it. Another key factor is responsibility. If order can be adjusted, then responsibility exists. Humans and gods can act to mitigate imbalance. If destruction is total and unavoidable, responsibility disappears. Ancient cultures resisted this implication. Their myths emphasize accountability, even among gods. Decisions have consequences. Excess invites correction. This moral dimension operates within adjustment, not annihilation. The sky, again, serves as the model. Planetary motions adjust gradually. Retrograde motion corrects apparent deviation. Long cycles realign reference points. Nothing explodes. Nothing vanishes. This model is applied metaphorically to society, politics, and theology. When order is adjusted, it often becomes simpler. Complexity accumulates during stable periods. When complexity exceeds capacity, reduction follows. This reduction is not necessarily regression. It can be adaptation. Ancient texts reflect this through condensed narratives. Later versions of myths are often shorter. Details are lost or merged. The core remains. This textual compression mirrors social adjustment. What is essential survives. What is excess fades. This is why ancient cultures did not fear adjustment as much as modern narratives suggest. They understood it as necessary. Fear appears when adjustment is resisted. When systems refuse to adapt, collapse becomes harsher. The texts warn against rigidity more than against change. Moments when order is adjusted rather than destroyed are therefore moments of survival. They represent the system's ability to recognize its limits and respond. These moments are rarely celebrated. They are endured. Endurance, not triumph, defines them. As the narrative continues toward the idea of a final phase, this distinction becomes increasingly important. A final phase does not negate adjustment. It intensifies it. Adjustment becomes broader. It affects more layers at once, but the principle remains the same. What can continue will. What cannot will fall away. The ancient worldview does not promise preservation of form. It promises preservation of function. Understanding this allows the rest of the exploration to proceed without invoking catastrophe. Change is not minimized. It is contextualized. Order bends so that it does not break. And in those moments when adjustment occurs quietly, without spectacle, without sudden impact, the ancient texts do not panic. They observe. They record. They preserve what matters. The cycle moves on, not because nothing was lost, but because enough remained to carry meaning forward into whatever configuration follows next. Silence and stillness play a central role at the end of a cycle, because ancient cultures understood transition not as an event, but as a condition. When a system approached the limits of its usefulness, activity did not immediately intensify. It diminished. Noise receded. Movement slowed. Attention shifted inward. These were not signs of failure. They were signs that the existing order was no longer producing meaningful variation, and that something different was required. In the oldest records, silence is rarely accidental. It is not simply the absence of information caused by loss or neglect. It appears deliberately, often following periods of intense activity or elaboration. Long genealogies suddenly shorten. Ritual instructions become less detailed. Divine interventions become rarer. These changes are subtle, but they are consistent across cultures and time periods. Silence functions as a buffer. It creates space between what has been and what will be. Without that space, transition would feel like rupture. Ancient cultures avoided rupture whenever possible. They understood that continuity depended on allowing systems to settle before being reshaped. Stillness serves a similar purpose. When cycles near completion, motion becomes repetitive rather than productive. Actions no longer generate new outcomes. In such moments, restraint becomes more valuable than effort. Continuing to push forward under outdated conditions risks damaging what remains functional. This logic is visible in how ancient texts describe divine behavior during periods of transition. Gods withdraw. They observe rather than intervene. Councils deliberate without issuing clear decrees. Authority becomes diffuse. These descriptions do not suggest abandonment. They suggest suspension. Suspension allows assessment. It allows conditions to reveal themselves without interference. Ancient cultures believed that forcing resolution too early could destabilize future order. Silence also protects memory. When speech continues without adjustment, it reinforces patterns that may no longer apply. Silence interrupts that reinforcement. It prevents outdated explanations from becoming dogma. This is why periods of silence in the texts often coincide with later reinterpretation. After a quiet interval, narratives resume with altered emphasis. New gods appear, old ones change roles, calendars are revised. The silence marks the boundary between frameworks. Stillness also appears in physical descriptions. Floodwaters settle, winds cease, darkness lingers before dawn. These images are not incidental. They reinforce the idea that transition requires pause. The ancient world associated stillness with potential. Creation myths often begin in a state of undifferentiated calm. Before separation, before motion, there is quiet. Ending cycles mirror beginnings in this respect. They return conditions closer to that calm without fully dissolving structure. This mirroring is intentional. It frames endings as preparation rather than termination. Silence at the end of a cycle is not empty. It is charged with possibility. Another reason silence appears at the end of cycles is exhaustion. Systems cannot sustain peak activity indefinitely. Ritual calendars become crowded. Administrative complexity increases. Social obligations multiply. Eventually, effort outweighs return. When this happens, reduction becomes necessary. Silence reduces demand. Stillness conserves energy. These are adaptive responses, not signs of collapse. Ancient texts reflect this pragmatism. They do not glorify constant action. They recognize limits. Silence also equalizes. During active periods, authority speaks frequently. Decrees are issued. Interpretations proliferate. At the end of a cycle, those voices diminish. No single narrative dominates. This leveling creates openness. It allows alternative structures to emerge without immediate suppression. In this sense, silence is political as well as cosmological. It weakens entrenched power by removing its primary tool, constant assertion. Stillness reinforces this effect. When movement slows, enforcement becomes difficult. Systems reliant on speed and expansion lose effectiveness. Ancient cultures understood this intuitively. They did not interpret slowing as weakness. They recognized it as transition. Another important aspect of silence is protection. Speaking prematurely during transition risks misinterpretation. Words spoken too early can bind future action unnecessarily. Silence avoids commitment. It keeps options open. This is why oracles and diviners often speak less during transitional periods. Their silence is not ignorance, it is caution. The sky itself models this behaviour. During certain phases, planetary motion appears to slow or reverse. Retrograde motion is not sudden, it is gradual. Planets pause before changing direction. Ancient observers interpreted these pauses as moments of reconsideration. The sky itself hesitated. This celestial stillness reinforced the idea that pause was not failure. It was necessary for adjustment. The end of a cycle, therefore, is not marked by explosion or announcement. It is marked by quiet convergence. Multiple movements slow simultaneously. Variation decreases. Patterns repeat without progress. This repetition without development signals completion. When nothing new emerges despite continued activity, the system has reached its limit. Silence follows because explanation no longer advances understanding. Continuing to speak within the old framework produces redundancy. The texts respond by reducing commentary. This reduction has often been misinterpreted as loss of knowledge. In reality, it reflects discernment. What is no longer useful is allowed to fade. Stillness also allows grief. Adjustment involves loss. Silence creates space to absorb that loss without immediately replacing it. Ancient lamentations often precede long quiet intervals. After grief is expressed, words cease. The community processes change internally before articulating new meaning. This pattern is visible in the archaeological record as well. Periods of cultural transition often show reduced inscription activity. Building slows, artistic styles simplify. These are not signs of emptiness, they are signs of reorientation. Silence also protects continuity across generations. Children born during transitional periods do not inherit rigid explanations. They grow into new frameworks without having to unlearn entrenched ones. This generational effect is crucial. Ancient cultures thought in terms of inheritance, not immediate resolution. The role of silence at the end of a cycle, therefore, extends beyond the moment itself. It shapes how the next cycle begins. Stillness also limits damage. When instability increases, action amplifies risk. Pausing reduces harm. This is why some ancient laws suspend enforcement during crisis. This is why rituals change frequency. This is why authority retreats. The goal is not control, it is preservation. Silence, in this sense, is conservative. It preserves what remains functional. Another subtle role of silence is concealment. Not concealment of truth, but concealment of vulnerability. During transition, systems are fragile. Drawing attention increases threat. Quiet reduces exposure. Ancient texts rarely dramatize vulnerability, they imply it through absence. This restraint has led later readers to underestimate the seriousness of these periods. In reality, silence often accompanies the most profound change. The absence of guidance forces communities to rely on internal cohesion. This tests resilience. Those that endure emerge adapted. Silence also interrupts cycles of blame. During active periods, misfortune invites accusation. Silence diffuses this tendency. By withholding explanation, ancient cultures avoided assigning fault prematurely. This prevented social fragmentation during already unstable times. The stillness at the end of a cycle also affects time perception. Without markers, time feels suspended. This suspension mirrors the threshold nature of transition. Thresholds are neither one state nor another, they're in between. Silence belongs to thresholds. This is why rites of passage often involve silence. Initiates are separated from ordinary speech. They return changed. Cycles function similarly at a societal level. When a cycle ends, society enters a liminal state. Silence marks that liminality. Ancient cultures recognized the power of this state. They treated it carefully. They did not rush to define it. The role of silence, therefore, is protective, adaptive, and preparatory. It prevents premature closure. It conserves energy. It preserves memory. Stillness complements this by reducing strain and allowing recalibration. Together, silence and stillness create the conditions necessary for transition without collapse. This is why the oldest records do not fill every gap. They leave space. That space is intentional. It allows the system to breathe. As this exploration continues, the importance of these quiet intervals becomes clearer. They are not failures of record keeping. They are signals of transition. The end of a cycle is not loud. It does not announce itself. It settles. Those who lived through it may not have known its significance. Those who came after recognized its effects. Silence carried the boundary between cycles. Stillness held it in place. From that quiet threshold, a new configuration eventually emerged, shaped by what had been preserved, limited by what had been lost, and informed by the restraint that allowed the transition to occur without erasing everything that came before. The cycle does not end with sound. It ends with space. And in that space, the conditions for what follows are quietly assembled, without urgency, without spectacle, and without the need to declare that anything has ended at all. Resets are described as measured rather than violent, because ancient cultures framed correction as a controlled response to imbalance, not as an emotional or destructive reaction. Violence implies loss of control. Measurement implies intention, restraint, and proportion. In the oldest records, change is never portrayed as something that happens because the system breaks. It happens because the system still functions well enough to correct itself. This distinction is subtle, but it runs through nearly every ancient description of large-scale transition. When conditions deteriorate, the response is not framed as eruption or collapse. It is framed as adjustment applied with limits. What is removed is specific. What is preserved is deliberate. This language reflects a worldview in which order remains present even when it's being revised. Violence is chaotic by nature. It spreads beyond its target. It produces consequences that exceed intention. Ancient cosmologies were deeply uncomfortable with this idea at a cosmic level. Chaos was something to be contained, not unleashed. Even when chaos appears in myth, it is quickly constrained, defeated, or reorganized into something usable. A reset, therefore, could not be violent in the uncontrolled sense. If it were, it would represent failure at the highest level of cosmic management. Instead, resets are framed as regulatory actions, comparable to pruning rather than burning. Excess is reduced, imbalance is corrected. The underlying structure remains intact. This measured quality is visible in how ancient texts describe loss. Loss occurs, but it is rarely indiscriminate. Certain cities fall while others remain. Certain lineages end while others continue. Certain practices are abandoned while core rituals persist. These patterns do not reflect randomness. They reflect selection. Selection implies judgment, but not in a moral sense. It implies assessment of function. What continues to serve order is retained. What no longer does is allowed to fade. Violent destruction would erase function indiscriminately. Measured resets refine it. Ancient flood narratives, often cited as examples of violence, actually support this interpretation when read carefully. The flood is catastrophic, but it is not unbounded. It lasts a defined period. It spares specific lives. It concludes with restoration. Its purpose is not annihilation, it is recalibration. The flood resets conditions by clearing accumulated imbalance. It does not destroy the world itself. The sky remains, the land remains, life resumes under new constraints. This pattern repeats in other traditions. Plagues come and go. Famines rise and fall. Empires collapse while culture survives. Each reset alters the field without erasing it. The language used to describe these processes is careful. Ancient texts often emphasize number, duration, and boundary. 7 days, 40 years, defined reigns, specified limits. These numbers are not always literal, but they indicate containment. Containment is the opposite of violence. It implies that forces are applied within bounds. This boundedness reflects a belief that excess, not existence, is the problem. Humanity becomes too numerous. Noise becomes too great. Complexity becomes unmanageable. The response reduces scale, not presence. If existence itself were the problem, annihilation would be the solution. Ancient texts never propose this. Another reason resets are measured lies in the role of continuity. Continuity is essential for meaning. Without continuity, history cannot be remembered, and lessons cannot be learned. Ancient cultures valued inheritance deeply. Knowledge, ritual, and authority were transmitted across generations. A violent reset would sever inheritance. A measured reset preserves it. This preservation is visible in how resets often involve survivors who carry memory forward. Survivors are not accidents. They are necessary components of the process. This does not mean the process is compassionate. It is pragmatic. Measured resets also preserve legitimacy. Authority that survives a reset can claim continuity with what came before. This stabilizes the new order. Violence would undermine legitimacy by destroying reference points. Ancient rulers understood this. They framed their reigns as restorations rather than revolutions. Even when overthrowing predecessors, they claimed to repair what had been damaged. This rhetoric mirrors cosmic narratives. The gods do not create a new world from nothing after each reset. They restore balance to the existing one. Violence, in contrast, is associated with breakdown. Wars between gods are portrayed as dangerous and destabilizing. They threaten order itself and require resolution. Resets are not wars, they are corrections. The measured nature of resets is also evident in timing. They do not occur impulsively. They follow prolonged periods of warning signs. Accumulation precedes action. Ancient texts often describe deliberation among gods. Councils meet. Decisions are weighed. Alternatives are considered. This deliberation would be unnecessary if destruction were the goal. Deliberation implies choice. Choice implies intention. Intention implies measurement. Another factor is reversibility. Violent destruction is irreversible. Measured resets often allow partial recovery. Recovery is essential for cycles. A cycle cannot repeat if everything is erased. This cyclical logic permeates ancient cosmology. Even the most severe resets are framed as temporary phases within a larger sequence. The language used to describe these phases reinforces this. Words associated with cleansing, settling, and quieting appear frequently. These words imply process, not explosion. Water cleanses by dissolving gradually. It does not shatter. Silence settles by absence. It does not strike. Fire, when it appears, is often controlled. It purifies. It transforms. It does not rage uncontrollably. Violence would contradict these metaphors. Ancient cultures were also attentive observers of nature. They knew that sudden, total destruction was rare. Even natural disasters followed patterns. Earthquakes occurred along fault lines. Floods followed seasons. Droughts followed climatic shifts. They extrapolated this understanding to cosmic processes. The universe behaved consistently. When it corrected, it did so according to law, not impulse. This lawfulness reassured them. It meant that existence was intelligible even when harsh. Measured resets also allowed moral frameworks to function. If resets were violent and arbitrary, moral behavior would be irrelevant. Ancient texts resist this implication. Even when suffering occurs, it is often framed as consequence rather than accident. This framing maintains coherence. Coherence matters because it sustains social order. People can endure hardship if they believe it fits within a comprehensible system. Violence undermines comprehension. Measurement supports it. Another reason resets are described as measured is that ancient cultures did not separate physical and symbolic reality sharply. Events had meaning beyond their immediate effects. A violent event would overwhelm meaning. A measured event could be interpreted, ritualized, and integrated. This integration is crucial. Ritual response depends on predictability. Offerings, prayers, and laws require stable reference points. Resets that occur within known patterns allow ritual adaptation. Violence would render ritual meaningless. This is why even catastrophic events are quickly ritualized. Calendars incorporate them. Myths contextualize them. Memory absorbs them. The absence of violent language also reflects restraint in storytelling. Ancient texts were not entertainment. They were tools for continuity. Exaggeration would reduce reliability. Measured language preserved trust. Later traditions that emphasized apocalypse emerged in different contexts. They often arose among displaced or oppressed communities. Their violence reflects social trauma, not inherited cosmology. The oldest records come from societies invested in maintaining order. Their narratives reinforce that investment. This does not mean ancient cultures were naive. They knew destruction. They experienced loss, but they refused to universalize it. Resets were painful but purposeful. They were necessary but contained. The final phase of a cycle in this framework is not an explosion. It is a narrowing. Options reduce. Complexity collapses into simplicity. Excess is shed. This process can feel severe, but it is not violent in the chaotic sense. It is directional. Direction implies destination, even if that destination is not fully known. Violence destroys direction. Measurement preserves it. The ancient emphasis on measured resets also reflects humility. Humans are not the arbiters of cosmic change. They respond to it. They do not provoke it. If resets were violent, resistance would be futile. Measurement allows participation. Participation takes the form of adaptation, not control. This distinction shapes how ancient cultures framed survival. Survival was not escape. It was alignment. Those who aligned with changing conditions endured. Those who clung to obsolete forms did not. This alignment required attentiveness, patience, and restraint. Violence rewards speed and force. Measurement rewards endurance. Ancient cultures valued endurance. This value is embedded in their texts, their laws, and their myths. Resets, therefore, are described as measured because measurement preserves meaning, continuity, and structure. Violence would negate all three. As this exploration continues, it becomes increasingly clear that fear-driven interpretations misrepresent the original intent of these traditions. The absence of violence is not oversight, it is principle. The world, as ancient cultures understood it, was not fragile, it was resilient. Resets tested that resilience. They did not seek to end it. The final phase of a cycle was not a blow. It was a correction applied slowly enough for something to remain. And because something remained, the cycle could continue, adjusted but intact, carrying forward what had been refined by restraint rather than erased by force. When cycles close, gods, kings, and authority do not vanish simultaneously, and they do not fall in the same way. Ancient texts treat these three elements as related but distinct layers of order, each responding differently when the conditions that sustained a cycle reach their limits. What changes first is not existence, but relevance. Roles that once held meaning lose precision. Titles remain, but their authority thins. Power persists, but its source shifts. In the oldest records, gods are not eternal in function, even when they are eternal in name. Their presence is tied to the conditions that require them. When those conditions change, divine roles adjust accordingly. Some gods recede into the background, others absorb new attributes, some merge with related figures. Very few are described as destroyed. Destruction would imply failure of the divine order itself. Reassignment implies continuity. This reassignment is often subtle. Hymns change emphasis. Rituals are performed less frequently. Certain divine epithets disappear while others become prominent. The god remains, but the way that God is encountered changes. Authority does not collapse, it redistributes. Kingship follows a similar pattern. Kings are presented as necessary mediators between cosmic order and human society. Their authority is valid only as long as they can embody that mediation. When cycles close, the conditions that made a particular form of kingship effective no longer hold. The king does not cease to exist, but kingship ceases to function in the same way. Ancient texts rarely describe the sudden removal of kings at the exact moment a cycle closes. Instead, they describe erosion. Legitimacy weakens. Omens become unfavourable. Support fragments. The king may still rule in name, but power has already shifted elsewhere. This distinction is important. Authority does not end when a ruler falls. It ends when obedience no longer aligns with meaning. In many cases, the fall of a king is described after the fact, not as the cause of transition, but as its visible symptom. The cycle closes first. Authority fails second. The sequence matters. Gods in these moments do not intervene dramatically to save kingship. Their withdrawal is part of the process. Divine silence increases. Oracles become ambiguous. Ritual certainty declines. This is not abandonment. It is transition. Authority, in ancient thought, is never self-sustaining. It requires alignment with cosmic order. When alignment falters, authority becomes performative rather than effective. Commands are issued, but outcomes no longer follow. This loss of efficacy is one of the clearest markers that a cycle has closed. Power without consequence is a sign that the framework supporting power has shifted. Importantly, ancient texts do not frame this as punishment. Kings are not struck down because they are morally corrupt in a modern sense. They fail because the role they occupy no longer fits the conditions of the world. The mismatch grows until replacement becomes inevitable. Replacement, however, does not always mean a new king in the same mould. Often, it means a redefinition of kingship itself. Titles change. Dynastic structures adjust. Authority may decentralize or concentrate differently. In some periods, priesthoods gain influence at the expense of kings. In others, military leaders emerge. In still others, councils or assemblies appear. These shifts are not anomalies, they are adjustments to new conditions. Gods adapt to these shifts as well. A god associated with kingship may gain judicial aspects when law becomes central. A god associated with fertility may gain martial traits when survival depends on defense. These transformations are documented through changing myths and rituals. The persistence of divine names across these transformations can be misleading. It creates the illusion of continuity where function has changed. Ancient texts assume the reader understands this distinction. Later readers often do not. When cycles close, authority also fragments. What was once unified becomes layered. Competing claims emerge. This fragmentation is not always chaotic. It can be managed through new structures. Ancient societies often responded by codifying law more strictly. When divine guidance felt distant, written law provided stability. This shift marks a significant reconfiguration of authority. Law replaces charisma. Procedure replaces personal mandate. The king becomes an administrator rather than a sacred figure. This transformation appears repeatedly across civilizations. It does not signal decline. It signals adaptation. Gods too adapt to this legalistic environment. They become guarantors of justice rather than direct rulers. Their presence is invoked in oaths rather than commands. This reflects a narrowing of divine intervention. The cycle closes, and with it, the expectation of constant divine action. Authority becomes more human-centered, but not autonomous. It still claims cosmic sanction, but that sanction is mediated through institutions rather than direct signs. This institutionalization of authority is one of the most common outcomes of cycle closure. It stabilizes society during transition. It reduces dependence on charismatic figures whose legitimacy may be contested. Kingship survives, but it survives differently. Gods survive, but they are encountered differently. Authority survives, but it is exercised differently. Another important change during cycle closure is the reassessment of lineage. Genealogy loses its absolute power. Being descended from a divine or heroic ancestor matters less than demonstrating competence under new conditions. This shift weakens dynasties that relied on inherited legitimacy. It strengthens those that can adapt. Ancient texts reflect this by shortening genealogies or emphasizing deeds over descent. Names that once carried weight are mentioned without elaboration. This reduction signals a shift in what matters. Divine councils, where they appear, also change tone. Early councils are decisive. Later ones deliberate endlessly or fail to act. This paralysis reflects uncertainty rather than conflict. Gods are not at war. They are recalibrating. The absence of decisive divine action during these periods has often been misinterpreted as decline in belief. In reality, it reflects a belief that intervention is no longer appropriate under current conditions. Ancient cosmology allowed for periods where the gods stepped back. This withdrawal was part of the cycle. During such periods, humans bore greater responsibility. Authority became more contingent. Mistakes had greater consequences. This increased responsibility often led to experimentation. New political forms emerged. Some failed. Others endured. The texts do not judge these experiments harshly. They record them. This neutrality is telling. It suggests that change itself was not feared. What was feared was stagnation. When cycles close, stagnation becomes visible. Systems repeat without producing stability. Authority insists without effect. Rituals continue without meaning. These are signs that adjustment is overdue. Gods respond by allowing structures to fail rather than propping them up indefinitely. Kings fall because kingship must change. This permissive collapse is not cruelty, it is necessity. Authority that persists beyond its usefulness becomes oppressive. Ancient texts recognize this implicitly. They allow collapse as a form of correction. This does not mean collapse is welcomed. Laments exist for a reason. Loss is mourned. But mourning does not imply rejection of the process. Another key feature of cycle closure is the narrowing of sacred geography. Fewer cities are considered central. Fewer temples hold universal significance. Pilgrimage routes shift. This contraction reflects the redistribution of authority. Centralization may increase or decrease depending on conditions. Gods associated with marginal spaces often gain prominence during these periods. Deities of thresholds, borders, and liminal zones become relevant. This reflects societal uncertainty. The divine landscape mirrors the human one. Kings may respond by emphasizing restoration. They rebuild temples. They invoke ancient traditions. They claim to revive old order. Sometimes this works, sometimes it fails. Failure occurs when restoration attempts to preserve form without restoring function. Ancient texts are sensitive to this distinction. Gods are portrayed as indifferent to hollow restoration. They respond to alignment, not nostalgia. Authority grounded in memory alone cannot endure. This principle explains why some reforms succeed while others do not. Those that adapt structure to new conditions endure. Those that attempt to freeze time collapse. Cycle closure exposes this difference. Another important aspect is communication. When cycles close, messages become indirect. Prophecy gives way to interpretation. Certainty fades. This shift does not eliminate meaning. It changes how meaning is accessed. Authority that once relied on divine mandate must now rely on consensus or enforcement. This transition can be unstable. It often produces conflict. Ancient texts do not conceal this conflict. They describe periods of confusion, competing claims, and uncertainty. But they also show resolution emerging over time. Resolution does not restore the old cycle, it establishes a new one. Gods, kings, and authority are reconfigured within this new framework. Names may remain, titles may persist, but their content changes. This continuity of language masks transformation. It allows societies to perceive stability while adapting. Ancient cultures valued this illusion. It reduced shock. The closing of a cycle is therefore not marked by divine disappearance or royal extinction. It is marked by thinning presence and diluted authority. Gods become distant. Kings become ordinary. Authority becomes procedural. This is not decay. It is transition. The texts reflect this by becoming less mythic and more administrative. Narrative gives way to record. Law replaces legend. This textual shift mirrors social reality. Later generations often look back on earlier periods as golden ages. This nostalgia emerges because myth flourishes during stable cycles. When cycles close, myth recedes. This does not mean belief disappears. It means belief becomes less expressive. Gods are still honoured. Kings still rule. Authority still exists. But the relationship between them has changed. Understanding this process helps explain why ancient cultures did not interpret cycle closure as divine abandonment. They understood it as redistribution of responsibility. Humans were expected to carry more weight. This expectation is both empowering and burdensome. It produces innovation and failure. Ancient texts record both without judgment. As cycles close, authority becomes more visible in its absence than in its presence. Where it once guided, it now constrains. Where it once unified, it now divides. These tensions are part of the process. Eventually a new configuration stabilizes. New gods rise in prominence. New forms of kingship emerge. Authority finds a new balance. The cycle continues, but it is not the same cycle. The old one has closed, not with violence, but with dilution. Gods did not die. They changed how they mattered. Kings did not vanish. They lost the certainty that once surrounded them. Authority didn't end. It learned new limits, and within those limits, the next cycle slowly took shape, informed by what had been preserved, shaped by what had been lost, and constrained by the quiet understanding that no configuration, however powerful, remains unchanged once its time has passed. Memory outlasting civilization is one of the most consistent themes in the oldest records, and it reveals how ancient cultures understood survival at a deeper level than physical continuity. Cities were expected to fall, dynasties were expected to end, languages were expected to change. None of this was seen as a failure of the world. What mattered was whether meaning could be carried forward when form could not. Ancient cultures did not assume that buildings, institutions, or political systems were permanent. They assumed the opposite. Permanence belonged to patterns, not to structures. Memory was the mechanism that allowed patterns to persist, even when their material expressions collapsed. This distinction explains why so much effort was invested in preservation that did not appear practical in the short term. Clay tablets were copied long after the events they described were no longer relevant to contemporary politics. Myths were recited that referred to cities no longer standing. Rituals were maintained whose original context had faded. These practices were not nostalgia, they were continuity strategies. Memory in this framework was not passive recollection, it was active maintenance. To remember was to keep something functional beyond its original environment. Civilizations, by contrast, were understood as situational. They arose to solve specific problems under specific conditions. When those conditions changed, the civilization that addressed them became obsolete. Preserving it unchanged would have been inefficient and dangerous. Memory allowed the solution to be extracted from the structure that once housed it. This is why ancient texts often appear layered. Older material is embedded within newer compositions. Contradictions coexist without being resolved. The goal was not coherence in the modern sense, It was retention. Retention did not require consistency. It required accessibility. A city could be destroyed, but its name could remain. That name could carry associations, lessons, warnings, and ideals. Future generations might not know the city's layout or governance, but they would know what it represented. This symbolic survival mattered more than architectural survival. The same principle applies to gods. A god's temple might collapse. Worship might cease in one location, but the god's attributes could migrate. Another culture might adopt the deity under a new name. Memory preserved function even when identity shifted. This migration of meaning is visible throughout ancient history. Deities merge, myths cross borders, rituals adapt, memory flows where stone cannot. Civilizations tied to geography and resources are less mobile. When conditions deteriorate, they fail. Memory tied to people and narrative travels. This mobility is why ancient cultures prioritized oral transmission alongside writing. Writing preserved detail. Oral tradition preserved adaptability. Stories could be adjusted without losing their core. Names could change. Settings could shift. The lesson remained. This adaptability allowed memory to survive across collapse. Writing, when it appears, often functions as a backup rather than a replacement. Clay tablets preserve fixed versions of myths and records, but they assume a living tradition around them. Without recitation, tablets were inert. This dual system created redundancy. If writing was lost, stories survived orally. If oral tradition fragmented, written versions could restore it. Civilizations, by contrast, lacked this redundancy. When infrastructure failed, governance collapsed quickly. Ancient cultures accepted this asymmetry. They invested in memory precisely because they knew civilization was fragile. Another reason memory outlasted civilization is selectivity. Not everything was preserved. Memory was curated. Ancient scribes and storytellers chose what to transmit. They did not attempt comprehensive preservation. They focused on what was considered essential. This selectivity is often mistaken for loss. In reality, it reflects prioritization. Genealogies shorten because distant ancestors no longer matter. Laws are revised because outdated rules cause harm. Myths are condensed because excessive detail obscures function. What remains is what still serves. This process explains why ancient records can feel incomplete. They are incomplete by design. Memory was preserved not to reconstruct the past exactly, but to inform the future. This forward orientation differentiates memory from history in the modern sense. Ancient memory was not about accuracy, it was about relevance. Civilizations, when they fell, took with them details that no longer mattered. Memory retained what did. This approach is evident in how disasters are remembered. Floods are remembered, but not every flood. Only those that altered patterns significantly. Wars are remembered, but not every battle. Only those that reshaped authority. The selection reflects impact on continuity, not scale of destruction. Another mechanism of memory preservation lies in ritual. Ritual encodes memory into action. Even when meaning fades, form persists. A ritual can be performed without understanding its origin. This allows memory to survive periods of ignorance. Later generations may reinterpret the ritual, but its repetition preserves structure. Civilizations, however, depend on understanding. Governance requires coordination, literacy, and compliance. When understanding collapses, governance fails. Ritual survives confusion better than bureaucracy. This resilience explains why religious practices often outlast political systems. Memory is also preserved through landscape. Sacred sites persist even when cities vanish. Ruins acquire meaning. Place becomes mnemonic. A hill, a river, a boundary stone carries memory without requiring administration. Civilizations require upkeep. Memory can attach to decay. This attachment transforms ruins into symbols rather than failures. Ancient cultures often built new structures atop old ones. This was not only practical, it was mnemonic. Layering preserved memory physically. Each generation stood on the remains of the previous one. This vertical continuity reinforced the idea that civilization was temporary, but memory was cumulative. Language also played a crucial role. Words carried meaning across change. Even when languages evolved, loanwords preserved older concepts. A term might lose its original pronunciation, but its association endured. This linguistic persistence allowed ideas to outlast political boundaries. Civilizations enforced language standardization. When they fell, linguistic diversity increased. Memory dispersed. Dispersion increased resilience. Another important aspect is that memory was often encoded indirectly. Myths do not state lessons explicitly. They dramatize them. This indirection allowed memory to survive reinterpretation. A story could mean different things under different conditions without losing its core. Civilizations, by contrast, relied on explicit instruction. Laws and decrees required precision. Precision does not age well. Ambiguity does. This ambiguity allowed memory to remain relevant. Ancient cultures understood this intuitively. They did not seek to eliminate ambiguity, they used it. This use of ambiguity is visible in cosmological narratives. Cycles are described without dates. Transitions occur without timelines. This allows repetition. A story that ends definitively cannot be reused. A story that ends with adjustment can. This reuse extends memory. Civilizations, however, often define themselves through finality. Founding dates, reign lengths, territorial boundaries. These specifics do not adapt easily. When those specifics fail, the civilization collapses. Memory is not bound to specifics. It generalizes. This generalization is not distortion. It is survival. Ancient memory also relied on moral compression. Complex histories were reduced to simple principles. Hubris invites correction. Balance must be maintained. Excess leads to collapse. These principles survive context. Civilizations embody principles temporarily. When embodiment fails, principle remains. This separation ensures continuity. Another factor is intergenerational transmission. Memory was passed deliberately from elders to younger members. Civilizations assume continuity without instruction. When continuity breaks, they fail. Memory anticipates discontinuity. This anticipation makes it robust. The oldest records reflect this awareness. They address future readers explicitly. They instruct scribes to copy text faithfully. They warn against forgetting. These warnings exist because forgetting was expected. Civilizations fall because forgetting is inevitable. Memory survives because it expects to be threatened. This defensive posture explains why memory persists even in hostile conditions. Stories survive conquest. Myths survive repression. Names survive exile. Civilizations rarely do. Memory is portable. Civilization is not. Another subtle reason memory outlasts civilization is emotional investment. People grieve lost cities. They sing about them. They remember. This emotional attachment sustains memory beyond utility. Civilizations require participation. Memory requires feeling. When participation becomes impossible, feeling persists. Ancient lamentations preserve this emotional dimension. They keep cities alive symbolically. These laments do not rebuild cities. They rebuild meaning. Meaning is what memory preserves. Civilizations preserve order. Memory preserves orientation. When order fails, orientation is still needed. Memory provides it. This orientation allows rebuilding, adaptation, and reinterpretation. Without memory, collapse would be terminal. Ancient cultures knew this. This is why they accepted the loss of civilization more readily than the loss of memory. Texts survive in fragments. Myths survive distorted. Names survive detached from origin. These survivals are not accidents, they are evidence of prioritization. The final phase of a cycle does not aim to erase memory. It relies on memory to seed the next cycle. Civilizations that resist this process by attempting to preserve form at all costs often fail more violently. They collapse without legacy. Those that allow memory to detach from form endure symbolically. This endurance matters because it informs future cycles. Later civilizations draw on ancient memory even when unaware of its origin. Ideas resurface, patterns repeat, lessons reappear. This recurrence is not coincidence, it is inheritance. Memory is the medium of inheritance. Civilizations are vehicles, they carry memory temporarily. When the vehicle breaks down, the cargo is transferred. Ancient cultures understood this transfer implicitly. This understanding shaped how they wrote, built, and remembered. They did not expect to be the last. They expected to be part of a sequence. Memory ensured that sequence could continue. This perspective reframes collapse. Collapse is not disappearance, it is transition of storage. What was stored in cities moves into stories. What was stored in institutions moves into ritual. What was stored in kingship moves into law. The form changes, the content persists. Understanding this process dissolves fear-based interpretations of ancient cycles. The end of a civilization is not the end of meaning. Meaning migrates. The role of memory is not to freeze the past, but to carry forward what remains usable. This is why ancient texts feel timeless. They were designed to outlast their immediate context. Civilizations were not. As cycles close, memory becomes more important, not less. It is the bridge between configurations. The quiet work of memory continues even when cities burn and authority fractures. It is slow, selective, and resilient. And because of it, no cycle truly ends in emptiness. It ends in transmission, carrying forward fragments that will eventually be reassembled into new forms that remember, however faintly, what came before. Humanity is never told when the final phase begins, because ancient cultures understood that foreknowledge of transition would distort behavior more than it would prepare it. Knowing the precise moment when a cycle shifts does not produce wisdom. It produces anxiety, hoarding, paralysis, or reckless urgency. The oldest traditions reflect a deep awareness of this psychological effect, and they structure their cosmologies accordingly. In these traditions, timing belongs to the system, not to its participants. Humans live within cycles, but they do not administer them. To announce the exact beginning of a final phase would be to hand control to those least capable of managing it. Ancient texts assume that most people respond poorly to deadlines attached to existential change. This is not cynicism. It is observation. When individuals believe an ending is imminent, they stop behaving as stewards of continuity. They either attempt to preserve everything rigidly or abandon responsibility altogether. Both responses accelerate collapse rather than soften transition. Ancient cultures did not frame survival as escape from a moment. They framed it as endurance through conditions. Endurance requires normalcy to continue for as long as possible. Announcing the beginning of a final phase would shatter that normalcy prematurely. This is why the oldest records avoid dates, countdowns, or explicit markers tied to endings. They describe conditions, patterns, and signs, but they stop short of declaration. The emphasis is on recognition after the fact, not anticipation before it. Another reason humanity is never told when the final phase begins is that cycles do not begin cleanly. There is no single moment that can be pointed to without simplification. A final phase emerges gradually, through accumulation of conditions rather than sudden change. Ancient observers understood this complexity. They knew that attempting to isolate a starting point would be misleading. Any date chosen would be arbitrary, favouring one symptom over another. By withholding timing, the texts preserve accuracy. This approach also reflects humility. Even the gods, in many traditions, do not act with absolute foresight. They deliberate, they observe, they respond. This portrayal implies that transition is dynamic, not scripted. If the gods themselves do not announce a fixed beginning, humans certainly would not expect one. The absence of timing also prevents false authority. If someone could claim to know exactly when a final phase begins, they could manipulate others through fear or promise. Ancient cultures were aware of this danger. Prophecy existed, but it was conditional. Oracles spoke in ambiguity. Omens required interpretation. Certainty was avoided deliberately. This ambiguity protected society from exploitation. Another important factor is responsibility. If people are told when a final phase begins, they may absolve themselves of responsibility for their actions. Everything becomes justified by inevitability. Ancient cultures resisted this logic. They believed that behavior always mattered, regardless of circumstance. Withholding timing preserved accountability. People were expected to act as if continuity mattered until it no longer did. This expectation sustained order longer than prediction would have. There is also a structural reason for silence around timing. Final phases are recognized through outcomes, not announcements. Authority fails. Rituals lose efficacy. Systems strain. These indicators are meaningful only in retrospect. Trying to name the beginning in advance would reverse cause and effect. Ancient texts respect sequence. They do not declare transitions before they occur. This respect for sequence explains why many records feel observational rather than predictive. They describe what unfolded, not what was scheduled. Another reason humanity is never told when the final phase begins lies in the function of memory. Memory preserves lessons only when they are learned through experience, not anticipation. If people knew the timing, they would prepare in ways that distort the lesson. They might survive physically, but fail to internalize the principles that led to the transition. Ancient cultures valued internalization over survival. This priority may seem harsh, but it reflects a long-term view. Survival without learning leads to repetition without correction. Withholding timing ensures that adaptation occurs organically. There is also the matter of scale. Final phases often unfold across generations. No single human lifespan encompasses the full transition. Announcing a beginning to one generation would be meaningless to another. Ancient cultures thought in terms of lineage, not individuals. Knowledge was passed forward. Timing that mattered only to one cohort was less valuable than patterns that persisted across many. By focusing on signs rather than dates, ancient texts ensured relevance regardless of when they were read. This timelessness is intentional. The sky itself reinforces this approach. Celestial cycles are not experienced as moments, they are experienced as tendencies. A planet does not announce its transition. It moves gradually into a new configuration. Ancient observers mirrored this restraint. They did not anthropomorphize the sky with declarations. Another subtle reason timing is withheld is compassion. Sudden awareness of impending transition could produce despair. Ancient cultures recognized despair as destabilizing. Hope, even if vague, was necessary for endurance. By not naming the beginning, the texts allowed hope to coexist with realism. This balance sustained societies longer than explicit warnings would have. It also prevented fixation. People who know they are living at the end often lose interest in maintenance. Why repair what is doomed? Ancient cultures understood that maintenance was always necessary, even during decline. Withholding timing preserved maintenance. This is visible in how rituals continued even when divine presence felt distant. The absence of confirmation did not excuse abandonment. The same logic applies to governance. Kings continued to rule even when legitimacy weakened. Administration persisted. Law remained. This persistence allowed transition to occur gradually rather than violently. Another factor is interpretive diversity. Without a fixed beginning, different communities experienced transition differently. Some adapted early, others later. This staggered adaptation reduced systemic shock. Uniform awareness would have synchronized panic. Ancient texts favor desynchronization. This decentralization of experience is protective. It also reflects realism. Not all regions experience change simultaneously. Rivers shift in one area before another. Trade routes decline unevenly. Authority fragments at different speeds. A single date would misrepresent this reality. Therefore, the final phase is never announced because it does not begin everywhere at once. Ancient cultures accepted unevenness. Another reason timing is withheld is that final phases are identified by absence rather than presence. Something stops working. Something ceases to respond. You cannot announce absence before it manifests. The silence of gods, the inefficacy of ritual, the thinning of authority are only recognizable once they occur. This recognition is experiential, not theoretical. Ancient texts respect this experiential threshold. There is also a protective element for memory. If timing were known, later generations might anchor memory to that date and neglect the broader pattern. This would reduce complexity. By avoiding dates, the texts encourage pattern recognition over fixation. Pattern recognition fosters wisdom. Another reason humanity is never told when the final phase begins is that ancient cultures did not believe knowledge guaranteed control. Knowing does not equal mastery. Modern thinking often assumes that foreknowledge enables intervention. Ancient thinking was more cautious. They believed some processes could not be altered, only navigated. Navigation requires attentiveness, not countdowns. This navigational mindset is evident throughout ancient cosmology. Signs guide, they do not dictate. The refusal to announce timing preserves this orientation. It also preserves humility. Humans are participants, not managers. This humility tempers fear. Fear arises when people believe they should be able to act but cannot. Ambiguity reduces this tension. By not telling humanity when the final phase begins, ancient cultures avoided creating expectations that could not be fulfilled. This restraint prevented disappointment and rebellion against perceived divine silence. Divine silence itself is easier to endure when it is not contrasted with a broken promise. Another subtle reason timing is withheld is to preserve narrative continuity. Stories that announce their ending lose tension. Ancient myths rely on gradual unfolding. This narrative technique mirrors lived experience. Life rarely announces its turning points. Ancient texts reflect life rather than impose structure upon it. This realism increases credibility. It also ensures reuse. A story without a dated beginning can apply repeatedly. This reusability is crucial for cyclical frameworks. Each generation can read itself into the narrative without contradiction. This is why ancient texts remain compelling across time. They do not confine themselves to one moment. They describe conditions, not schedules. Another reason humanity is never told when the final phase begins is that final phases do not require preparation in the modern sense. They require alignment. Alignment is behavioral, not logistical. It involves restraint, adaptability, and memory. You cannot stockpile alignment, you cultivate it. This cultivation occurs over long periods, not at a designated start. Ancient cultures focused on cultivating dispositions rather than issuing warnings. Their texts emphasize balance, moderation, and attentiveness. These qualities prepare societies for any phase, not just final ones. This universality makes the teaching durable. If preparation depended on knowing timing, most generations would be unprepared. By removing timing, preparation becomes continuous. This continuity is intentional. Another factor is the avoidance of blame. If timing were known, failure to act could be judged harshly. Ancient cultures often avoided this moral rigidity. They recognized that conditions constrain action. Withholding timing prevents simplistic blame narratives. It preserves complexity. Finally, humanity is never told when the final phase begins because the final phase is not a moment to be announced. It is a process to be lived. Announcement belongs to authority. Transition belongs to reality. Ancient texts privilege reality. They describe how things feel, not when they start. They record what changes, not when it is declared. This approach preserves truth across uncertainty. As this exploration continues, the absence of timing becomes increasingly meaningful. It is not a gap, it is a feature. It ensures that attention remains on behaviour rather than anticipation, on adaptation rather than escape. The final phase does not begin with a signal. It begins with subtle shifts that only become clear in hindsight. Those living through it may not name it. They simply respond. Those who come after recognise it by its effects. This delayed recognition preserves continuity while allowing transformation. By never telling humanity when the final phase begins, ancient cultures ensured that life continued to be lived responsibly for as long as possible, without surrender to fear, without obsession with endings, and without abandoning the quiet work of maintenance that carries meaning forward, even as cycles quietly adjust themselves into whatever form comes next. Parallels between ancient cycle endings and later collapse myths exist, because later societies inherited fragments of earlier frameworks without inheriting the full context that once made those frameworks intelligible. What began as measured descriptions of transition gradually transformed into dramatic narratives of collapse as memory compressed, conditions changed, and fear replaced familiarity with cyclical thinking. In the oldest records, cycle endings are described through adjustment, withdrawal, and redistribution of order. Later collapse myths preserve these same structural elements, but they reinterpret them through the lens of societies experiencing instability, without the stabilizing assumptions that once accompanied cyclical models. The result is a shift in tone rather than a change in underlying pattern. One of the clearest parallels lies in the motif of decline before catastrophe. Ancient texts describe periods where authority weakens, rituals lose clarity, and guidance becomes ambiguous. These descriptions are observational. They do not assign blame or predict annihilation. Later myths retain the sequence but intensify its emotional framing. Decline becomes corruption. Ambiguity becomes deception. Silence becomes abandonment. The structure remains the same, only the interpretation changes. Another parallel appears in the way knowledge is treated. In ancient cycle endings, knowledge is preserved selectively. It is condensed and carried forward quietly. In later collapse myths, this same process is reframed as loss or suppression. Knowledge is said to be stolen, hidden, or destroyed deliberately. This reinterpretation reflects anxiety rather than evidence. When societies no longer trust continuity, preservation feels insufficient. What was once understood as necessary reduction becomes interpreted as malicious erasure. The flood narrative provides a clear example. In its oldest forms, the flood resets conditions while preserving life, memory, and order. In later retellings, the flood becomes increasingly moralized and violent. The emphasis shifts from correction to punishment. The core elements remain intact. Water overwhelms. Survivors endure. A new order emerges. What changes is the explanation of why. This same pattern appears in myths of lost golden ages. Ancient texts describe earlier periods as stable but limited. Later myths describe them as perfect and unjustly destroyed. The difference lies not in the event but in nostalgia. Nostalgia transforms transition into tragedy. Another recurring parallel is the figure of the warning that goes unheeded. In ancient cycle models, warnings are diffuse. They appear as conditions rather than proclamations. Later myths introduce prophets, seers, or messengers whose explicit warnings are ignored. This shift reflects a need to assign responsibility. If collapse is feared, someone must be blamed for failing to prevent it. Ancient frameworks resisted this impulse. They treated transition as impersonal. Later myths personalize it. The motif of divine withdrawal also persists across both traditions. In early texts, gods withdraw quietly as cycles close. Their silence is structural. In later collapse myths, this withdrawal becomes abandonment or punishment. Again, the event is the same. The interpretation changes. Later myths often exaggerate scale. What was once regional becomes global. What was once gradual becomes sudden. What was once measured becomes violent. These exaggerations reflect the psychological state of societies experiencing collapse without confidence in renewal. Without belief in cycles, collapse feels terminal. Terminality demands drama. Ancient cycle endings did not require drama, because continuity was assumed. Later societies, lacking that assumption, filled the gap with spectacle. Another important parallel is the treatment of time. Ancient cycle endings are timeless. They occur without dates. Later collapse myths anchor endings to specific moments, often tied to calendars, prophecies, or omens. This anchoring reflects a desire for certainty. When stability erodes, people seek fixed points. Dates provide the illusion of control. Ancient cultures avoided this illusion deliberately. Later myths also introduce external threats more frequently. Invasions from the sky, monsters from beyond the world, or sudden cosmic events replace internal exhaustion as explanations for collapse. This shift externalizes responsibility. It allows societies to see themselves as victims rather than participants in transition. Ancient frameworks did not require victimhood. They assumed participation. The myth of Atlantis illustrates this pattern clearly. Plato's account describes moral decline followed by destruction, but it retains elements of cycle logic. Atlantis is not the end of the world, it is the end of a particular order. Later interpretations transform Atlantis into a lost utopia, destroyed unjustly. The transition from example to warning marks the shift from cycle narrative to collapse myth. Similarly, Norse myths of Ragnarok preserve cyclical elements, even as they adopt apocalyptic language. Destruction is followed by renewal. Survivors rebuild. The world returns altered but intact. Ragnarok sits at the boundary between ancient cycle thinking and later collapse myth. It retains both. The presence of renewal in these myths is not accidental. It is the residue of older cyclical frameworks persisting within newer linear narratives. Where renewal is removed entirely, collapse myths become more anxious and final. Another parallel appears in the role of excess. Ancient cycle endings emphasize excess as the trigger for adjustment. Later myths retain excess, but moralize it more aggressively. Excess becomes sin rather than imbalance. This moralization intensifies fear. Sin implies judgment. Imbalance implies correction. The same events are interpreted differently. Collapse myths also tend to simplify causality. Ancient cycles allow for multiple contributing factors. Later myths reduce collapse to a single cause or betrayal. This simplification makes stories easier to transmit but less accurate. It also heightens drama. Another parallel lies in how survivors are portrayed. In ancient cycle endings, survivors are functional. They carry memory and rebuild quietly. In later myths, survivors are often heroic, chosen, or morally superior. This change reflects shifting values. Survival becomes proof of worth rather than necessity. Ancient frameworks did not equate survival with virtue. They equated it with alignment. Later myths equate survival with righteousness. The difference alters how collapse is perceived. In ancient texts, collapse is not a test. In later myths, it becomes one. This testing narrative reinforces fear and competition. Another shared element is silence after collapse. Ancient texts describe quiet periods following transition. Later myths interpret this silence as desolation or divine absence. Again, the condition is the same. The meaning shifts. The quiet interval that once allowed reorganization becomes a symbol of loss. This reinterpretation is particularly strong in cultures that experience irreversible decline. Without recovery, silence feels permanent. Ancient cultures that rebuilt repeatedly did not experience silence this way. The preservation of place names in later myths also reflects ancient memory patterns. Ruins become sacred. Lost cities become legendary. This continuity preserves fragments of older cycle endings within collapse myths. The mythologization of ruins transforms adjustment into tragedy. Yet even within these myths, structural echoes remain. Cycles still turn. Worlds still renew, even if faintly. This persistence suggests that cyclical thinking was never fully erased. It was overwritten. Collapse myths are therefore not new inventions. They are reinterpretations of older patterns filtered through different expectations. When societies lose confidence in continuity, they reinterpret transition as termination. Ancient cycle endings assumed continuity without needing to assert it. Later myths assert termination because continuity feels uncertain. This difference explains why later collapse myths are louder, darker, and more absolute. They are compensating for the absence of trust. The parallels between ancient cycle endings and later collapse myths reveal continuity beneath distortion. The same sequence appears again and again: excess, adjustment, silence, reconfiguration. What changes is not the sequence, but the story told about it. Understanding this allows modern readers to recognize fear-based embellishment without dismissing the underlying pattern. Collapse myths feel convincing because they are rooted in real transitions. They feel overwhelming because they remove the assumption of renewal. Ancient frameworks did not need reassurance. They assumed return. Later myths needed reassurance but did not trust it. This tension shapes their narratives. As this exploration continues, recognizing these parallels prevents misreading ancient texts through later anxiety. It allows the original logic to re-emerge. Cycles do not end in spectacle, they end in transition. When later myths replace transition with catastrophe, they reveal more about the fears of their authors than about the intentions of the oldest records. Beneath every collapse myth lies the shadow of a cycle that once closed quietly, without declaration, without finality, and without the assumption that meaning itself had been destroyed. What the texts suggest is carried forward after each cycle is not power, territory, or dominance, but function, memory, and constraint. Ancient records consistently imply that when a cycle concludes, very little of what appeared central is preserved in its original form. What endures is not the visible structure of a civilization, but the underlying principles that allowed it to operate at all. The most persistent element carried forward is not material wealth. Cities fall, storehouses burn, and trade networks collapse. The texts do not linger on attempts to preserve these things beyond their usefulness. Material accumulation is treated as situational. It belongs to a phase, not to continuity. Instead, what survives is knowledge refined by failure. Techniques that proved resilient are retained. Those that depended on excess are abandoned. This refinement is quiet. It does not announce itself as progress. It appears later, embedded within new practices that seem ordinary to those who inherit them. Agricultural knowledge is a clear example. When cycles close due to environmental strain, the response is not to preserve old methods unchanged. It is to adapt. Crops change. Irrigation techniques simplify or decentralize. The idea of farming persists, but its expression alters. The texts imply this through shifts in ritual calendars and seasonal markers, rather than explicit instruction. This pattern extends beyond agriculture. Social organization follows the same logic. Hierarchies that proved brittle are replaced with ones that distribute responsibility differently. Authority becomes narrower in scope but more precise. The broad claims of divine kingship give way to codified law. What is carried forward is the idea that order requires structure, not the belief that a single figure embodies it. Another element preserved across cycles is moral compression. Complex ethical systems simplify into core principles. Excess invites correction. Balance must be maintained. Power without restraint leads to collapse. These ideas recur across cultures separated by time and geography. Their recurrence suggests inheritance rather than coincidence. These principles survive because they are portable. They do not require institutions to function. They can be taught orally, embedded in stories, or expressed through ritual. Their simplicity allows them to cross periods of instability intact. Language itself is carried forward selectively. Entire vocabularies vanish, but certain words persist. These words often relate to boundaries, obligation, and order. Their survival indicates what mattered most. When languages evolve, these terms anchor continuity. They carry concepts that resist erosion. The texts also suggest that memory of failure is preserved more carefully than memory of success. Victories fade, warnings endure. This asymmetry is deliberate. Success breeds imitation without understanding. Failure invites reflection. Ancient myths often encode this memory indirectly. A fallen city becomes a cautionary tale. A collapsed dynasty becomes a symbol. The lesson persists even when details blur. This is why the texts rarely celebrate endings. They emphasize consequence rather than conclusion. The past is not preserved to glorify what was, but to inform what follows. Another element carried forward is ritual structure. Rituals change in content, but their form persists. Repetition, offering, boundary marking, and purification appear again and again. These actions organize time and behavior even when belief shifts. Ritual provides continuity of rhythm. Even when meaning is reinterpreted, the act itself anchors experience. This rhythm stabilizes societies emerging from transition. The texts imply that ritual survives because it requires minimal explanation. It can be performed without full understanding. This allows continuity across knowledge gaps. Legal principles also persist, though laws change. The idea that behavior should be regulated survives every collapse. Codes are rewritten, but the expectation of accountability remains. This continuity suggests that what is carried forward is not law, but the need for law. Similarly, the idea of record-keeping persists even when records are lost. New administrations arise and immediately begin documenting. This impulse reflects inherited understanding that memory requires structure. The medium changes. Clay tablets give way to parchment, stone, or oral record. The function remains. Another element carried forward is spatial memory. Sacred sites retain significance even when their original purpose fades. New temples rise on old foundations. This layering preserves memory physically. The texts do not frame this as reverence alone. It is practical. Places already invested with meaning require less explanation. They anchor identity. This anchoring becomes critical during transition. When social structures weaken, place provides stability. The sky itself is carried forward conceptually. Celestial observation persists even when interpretive systems change. New calendars replace old ones, but the practice of watching remains. This persistence suggests that orientation, not prediction, is the enduring function. Ancient texts imply that cycles carry forward awareness rather than certainty. Knowledge becomes more cautious. Claims narrow. Absolute statements recede. This reduction is not intellectual decline. It is adaptation to complexity. Another enduring element is limitation. Each cycle seems to pass forward a tighter boundary on acceptable excess. Lifespans shorten. Authority fragments. Resource use becomes constrained. These limits are not portrayed as punishment. They are portrayed as stabilization. Stabilization is carried forward because it allows continuity under new conditions. The text also suggests that silence itself is inherited. Later cultures retain gaps, pauses, and ambiguities. These are not filled immediately. Silence becomes part of the tradition. This inherited silence preserves openness. It prevents premature closure. Another important element carried forward is humility. Ancient texts often contrast earlier certainty with later restraint. Knowledge becomes less declarative, more observational. This shift is subtle but persistent. It appears in reduced divine intervention, increased human responsibility, and greater emphasis on law over charisma. Humility allows adaptation. Arrogance invites collapse. The inheritance of humility is therefore functional. The texts also imply that stories survive even when belief changes. Myths are retold as allegory rather than history. Their function shifts from explanation to orientation. This flexibility allows myths to survive without demanding literal belief. Civilizations that insist on literal preservation of myth often fracture when belief erodes. Those that allow reinterpretation endure symbolically. Another element carried forward is the concept of threshold. Boundaries between states, roles, and spaces remain significant. Even when specific rituals fade, the idea of transition persists. Birth, death, initiation, and succession remain ritualized across cycles. This continuity reflects inherited understanding that thresholds require management. The texts also suggest that craftsmanship survives better than grand architecture. Skills pass through apprenticeship. Techniques adapt. Mastery persists even when projects shrink. This survival of skill over monument reflects practical inheritance. Knowledge that can be practiced survives more reliably than knowledge that must be displayed. Another element carried forward is the memory of imbalance. Ancient cultures do not forget why a cycle ended, even if they forget how. Excess is remembered abstractly. Causes are generalized. This generalization allows future application. The texts imply that memory becomes less specific but more universal. This universality increases resilience. The role of elders also persists across cycles. Authority shifts, but age retains significance. Elders carry memory. Their role becomes more advisory than directive. This shift reflects adaptation to reduce certainty. Advice replaces command. The texts also suggest that art changes form but not function. Representation becomes simpler. Symbolism intensifies. Art carries memory through abstraction. This abstraction allows survival when resources decline. The function of art as memory device persists. Another element carried forward is the expectation of return. Even when cycles close painfully, the assumption that something will follow remains. This expectation sustains effort. Without it, collapse would become terminal. The texts never suggest that continuity itself ends. They suggest that form does. This distinction is central. What is carried forward is not the past, but the capacity to respond. This capacity includes memory, restraint, pattern recognition, and humility. These qualities are not visible structures. They do not appear in ruins. They appear in behavior. The texts imply that each cycle leaves behind a residue of understanding that shapes the next. This residue is uneven. Some lessons are learned, others are forgotten. But enough remains to prevent total repetition. This partial learning explains why cycles resemble each other without being identical. The carried forward elements act as constraints. They limit how far error can recur. This limiting function is subtle. It operates across generations. Ancient texts do not present this as progress. They present it as survival. Progress implies direction. Survival implies sufficiency. The difference matters. Another element carried forward is the idea that endings are not final. This belief itself is inherited. It shapes response to collapse. Societies that believe in continuity rebuild. Those that believe in finality despair. Ancient texts preserve continuity belief intentionally. They do so by refusing definitive endings. This refusal is not evasive, it is strategic. Another persistent element is the relationship between heaven and earth. Even when gods withdraw, the idea that the sky matters remains. Celestial observation continues. Interpretation changes. The sky remains a reference. This continuity stabilizes time perception. When earthly order collapses, celestial order reassures. This reassurance is inherited. The texts also imply that certain numerical structures persist. Calendars change, but cycles remain. Weeks, months, and seasons continue to organize time. This temporal inheritance anchors daily life. Without it, disorientation would be severe. Another carried forward element is the recognition of limits to control. Ancient texts repeatedly emphasize that not everything can be managed. This recognition tempers ambition. It discourages overreach. This restraint survives collapse because it is learned through failure. Failure teaches limits more effectively than success. The texts preserve this lesson indirectly. They show consequences rather than issuing commands. Another element carried forward is the concept of stewardship. Even when ownership dissolves, responsibility remains. People care for land, family, and memory. This stewardship persists because it is local. Local practices survive systemic collapse. The texts imply that central authority fades before local responsibility. This decentralization preserves continuity. Another element carried forward is adaptability itself. Cultures that survive transition do so by adjusting without losing core orientation. The texts celebrate this implicitly by preserving stories of those who endured quietly rather than those who resisted dramatically. Quiet endurance is valorized. Another element carried forward is skepticism toward permanence. Ancient texts repeatedly warn against assuming stability. This skepticism survives collapse because it is validated by experience. Future societies inherit caution. This caution tempers hubris. Another subtle inheritance is grief. Lamentations preserve emotional truth. They validate loss without demanding restoration. This emotional honesty survives collapse. It allows healing. The texts imply that grief is necessary for transition. Suppressing it leads to rigidity. Another element carried forward is narrative flexibility. Stories are retold differently. Meaning shifts. This flexibility allows relevance. Rigid narratives fracture. Ancient texts survive because they are adaptable. Another inheritance is silence itself. Gaps persist. Unexplained passages remain. These gaps invite reinterpretation. They prevent closure. This openness allows continuation. Finally, what the texts suggest is carried forward after each cycle is not certainty, but capacity. Capacity to remember selectively. Capacity to adapt. Capacity to endure without knowing outcomes. Capacity to rebuild without replicating excess. Capacity to accept limits. These capacities are not taught explicitly. They are embedded in stories, rituals, and silences. They pass quietly from one configuration to the next. Civilizations dissolve because they are heavy, fixed, and context-bound. Memory persists because it is light, mobile, and responsive. The final phase of a cycle strips away what cannot move. What remains is what can. That remainder is not dramatic. It does not announce itself. It simply continues, carried forward by those who inherit fragments and assemble them into new forms, guided less by what was lost than by what proved capable of surviving the passage from one cycle into the next. Survival is rarely the focus in end-phase accounts, because ancient cultures did not measure success by who remained alive at the end of a transition. Survival, by itself, was not considered meaningful unless it preserved function, memory, and orientation. To endure physically while losing coherence was not victory. It was delay. End-phase narratives reflect this distinction consistently, even when describing events that involved immense suffering or population loss. In the oldest texts, survival is assumed rather than highlighted. People survive floods, collapses, and migrations, but the narratives do not linger on their individual endurance. Instead, attention shifts quickly to what kind of world those survivors inhabit afterward. The question is never simply who lived. It is what conditions now exist for order to continue. This framing reflects a long-term perspective. Ancient cultures were not concerned with maximizing the number of survivors in a single generation. They were concerned with whether the next configuration of society would remain viable across time. Survival without structure would only postpone collapse. Because of this, end-phase accounts emphasize continuity of function over continuity of bodies. If law persists, if ritual adapts, if memory carries forward, then survival has meaning. If these fail, survival becomes temporary. This is why survivors in ancient narratives are often anonymous. Their names are unimportant. What matters is their role as carriers rather than as individuals. They are vessels of continuity, not heroes. Later traditions often misunderstand this anonymity as indifference. In reality, it reflects prioritization. Individual stories mattered less than systemic endurance. Another reason survival is rarely foregrounded is that ancient cultures expected mortality. Death was not exceptional. It was integrated into worldview. To focus excessively on survival would have implied fear of death itself, which ancient traditions largely avoided. Fear destabilizes order. Acceptance stabilizes it. End-phase accounts reflect acceptance rather than panic. This acceptance does not diminish suffering. Lamentations exist precisely because loss is acknowledged. But lament is not the same as fixation. Grief is expressed, then absorbed into continuity. Survival narratives, by contrast, tend to fixate on escape, endurance, or triumph. These themes belong to cultures that experience disruption as abnormal. Ancient cultures experience disruption as inevitable. Another reason survival is de-emphasized is that end-phase transitions often unfold gradually. There is no single moment when survival can be clearly defined. People do not flee a sudden endpoint. They adapt over time. Gradual transitions do not produce dramatic survival stories. They produce quiet adaptation. Ancient texts reflect this reality. They describe migration without drama. They mention decline without spectacle. They focus on adjustment rather than escape. Survival is also rarely highlighted because it can misrepresent cause. If survival becomes the focus, collapse appears external and hostile. End-phase accounts emphasize internal exhaustion instead. Internal exhaustion cannot be outrun. You do not survive it by fleeing. You survive it by adapting. This shifts attention away from individuals and towards systems. Ancient cultures understood that systems survive through transformation, not resistance. Those who resisted change often suffered more. This is why end-phase narratives caution against clinging to obsolete forms, rather than celebrating escape. Survival stories tend to valorize resistance. End-phase accounts valorize recognition of limits, recognition of timing, recognition that something has ended even if life continues. Another reason survival is rarely foregrounded is that ancient texts were written by those who lived after transitions, not during them. Survivors did not record their survival as an achievement. They recorded the new order that followed. From their perspective, survival was a given. What required explanation was the change in structure. This retrospective orientation shapes the narrative. Later readers often project modern survival anxiety onto these texts. They expect dramatic accounts of escape. They find instead quiet descriptions of reorganization. This mismatch creates confusion. Another important factor is moral framing. Survival narratives often imply merit. Those who survive are worthy. Those who do not are deficient. Ancient cultures avoided this implication. They did not equate survival with virtue. Flood survivors are not described as superior. They are described as necessary. This neutrality preserves coherence. It prevents moral inflation. End-phase accounts focus on alignment rather than worthiness. Those aligned with changing conditions endure. Those misaligned do not. Alignment is behavioral, not moral. This distinction is subtle but crucial. Survival is also rarely emphasized because ancient cultures were concerned with stewardship rather than preservation. Stewardship involves caring for what remains functional, not saving everything. Survival implies rescue. Stewardship implies responsibility. End phase narratives emphasize responsibility. Responsibility persists after survival. Another reason survival is de-emphasized lies in scale. End phase transitions often span generations. Survival cannot be attributed to a single decision or moment. Who survived becomes less relevant than how practices evolved. This generational scale resists heroic framing. Ancient texts do not celebrate heroes of transition. They record shifts in order. This absence of heroism is often misread as pessimism. In reality, it reflects realism. Heroic survival implies singular action. Cyclical transition requires collective adaptation. Another factor is memory preservation. If survival were the focus, memory would narrow to individual experience. End phase accounts aim to preserve broader lessons. They sacrifice detail to retain pattern. This sacrifice is deliberate. Survival details fade, structural changes endure. Ancient cultures prioritized what could inform future behavior. Another reason survival is rarely highlighted is that end phase transitions often reduce population deliberately through natural limitation. Famine, disease, and resource constraint appear as mechanisms of adjustment. These mechanisms are harsh but impersonal. Focusing on survival would personalize them and obscure their function. Ancient texts resist personalization at this level. They describe processes, not victims. This does not negate compassion. It reflects analytical distance. That distance allows understanding. Another reason survival is not emphasized is that ancient cultures believed that living through an end phase did not guarantee participation in the next cycle. Some survivors remained bound to obsolete frameworks and faded quietly. Survival alone did not ensure relevance. Relevance required adaptation. End phase accounts focus on adaptation. Another important point is that survival narratives create expectation of exception. They suggest that someone will be spared. Ancient frameworks do not promise sparing. They promise continuity. Continuity does not require universal survival. This realism prevents disappointment. Ancient cultures did not offer guarantees. They offered orientation. Another reason survival is rarely central is that end phase accounts often serve instructional purposes. They teach what to release, not what to cling to. Survival encourages clinging. Instruction encourages discernment. Discernment preserves function. Ancient texts repeatedly emphasize release. Release of excess. Release of obsolete authority. Release of unsustainable practices. Survival narratives rarely emphasize release. Another factor is the avoidance of fear-based motivation. Survival stories often rely on fear to create urgency. Ancient cultures avoided fear when possible. Fear destabilizes judgment. End phase accounts use restraint to maintain clarity. This restraint produces calm tone even in dire circumstances. That calm has been misinterpreted as detachment. It is discipline. Another reason survival is not emphasized is that ancient cultures did not view death as the ultimate loss. Loss of orientation was worse. You can die and still contribute to continuity through memory. You can live and still contribute to collapse through misalignment. This worldview reframes importance. Survival becomes secondary. Another subtle reason survival is rarely foregrounded is that ancient cultures believed cycles applied to humanity as a whole, not to individuals. The unit of analysis was collective. Individual survival did not define collective outcome. Collective adaptation did. End phase accounts reflect this scale. Another factor is the preservation of dignity. To reduce transition to survival struggle would diminish meaning. Ancient cultures sought meaning even in loss. They framed endings as necessary rather than humiliating. Survival stories often emphasize desperation. End-phase accounts emphasize inevitability. Inevitability reduces shame. Another reason survival is rarely the focus is that ancient cultures understood that focusing on survival can produce destructive behavior. Hoarding, violence, betrayal. By not emphasizing survival, narratives discouraged these behaviors. They promoted restraint. Restraint preserved social cohesion. Social cohesion mattered more than individual survival. Another factor is narrative economy. End-phase accounts are compressed. They omit detail to preserve pattern. Survival stories require detail. Detail distracts from lesson. Ancient texts sacrifice immediacy for durability. Another reason survival is rarely central is that end-phase transitions often involve reduction in complexity. Complexity is lost quietly. Survival narratives tend to inflate complexity through drama. Ancient frameworks do the opposite. They simplify. This simplification aids transmission. Another subtle point is that survival implies opposition. Something threatens, something resists. Ancient cycle endings do not frame transition as enemy action. They frame it as systemic necessity. Necessity cannot be fought. It can only be accommodated. Survival narratives encourage fight. End-phase accounts encourage adjustment. This difference explains the tonal contrast between ancient records and later apocalyptic myths. Apocalyptic myths foreground survival because they frame collapse as attack. Ancient cycle accounts do not. Another reason survival is rarely emphasized is that ancient cultures were invested in preventing recurrence of imbalance, rather than celebrating endurance through it. They cared more about preventing repetition than about surviving one instance. End-phase accounts preserve cautionary principles. Survival narratives preserve identity. Ancient cultures prioritized principle over identity. Another factor is the role of elders. Elders transmit memory. Survival narratives often center youth, strength, and escape. End-phase accounts center elders implicitly through preservation of knowledge. Knowledge survival matters more than physical vigor. Another reason survival is rarely the focus is that ancient cultures believed that cycles test systems, not individuals. Systems pass or fail. Individuals adapt or fade. The narrative follows the system. This systemic focus shapes the writing. Another subtle reason is that survival implies a finish line. End-phase accounts resist finish lines. They flow into what follows. Survival stories end with rescue. Ancient cycle narratives continue. This continuity aligns with their worldview. Another factor is that survival stories risk glorifying suffering. End-phase accounts acknowledge suffering without glorifying it. They treat suffering as signal rather than spectacle. Another reason survival is rarely foregrounded is that ancient cultures did not see themselves as exceptions. They expected to be replaced. Survival narratives assume uniqueness. Ancient cultures assumed succession. This humility permeates the texts. Another reason survival is not emphasized is that ancient cultures believed continuity depended on restraint rather than endurance. Endurance without restraint leads to repetition. Restraint enables change. End-phase accounts teach restraint. Another reason survival is rarely the focus is that ancient cultures believed that life continues regardless of individual outcome. The world persists. The cycle turns. Survival is not the axis. Another subtle point is that survival narratives often invite speculation about who will be saved. Ancient texts avoid this divisiveness. They do not rank survivors. They do not assign categories. This prevents hierarchy during transition. Hierarchy would destabilize adaptation. Another reason survival is rarely foregrounded is that ancient cultures prioritized acceptance over resistance. Acceptance does not mean passivity. It means realistic engagement. Survival narratives often emphasize defiance. Ancient cycle accounts emphasize understanding. Another factor is that survival narratives often encourage exceptionalism. Those who survive believe they're chosen. Ancient cultures avoided chosenness in end-phase contexts. Chosenness undermines collective responsibility. Another reason survival is not emphasized is that ancient cultures believed that survival without learning was meaningless. Learning required loss. Loss had to be acknowledged. Survival stories often skip learning. Ancient texts embed learning. Another subtle reason survival is rarely foregrounded is that ancient cultures believed that cycles refine humanity gradually. Refinement requires attrition. This is not cruelty, it is selection of function. End-phase accounts reflect this harsh realism. Another reason survival is not central is that ancient cultures believed in return. Return does not require everyone to survive. It requires enough to remember. This sufficiency principle governs the narratives. Another reason survival is rarely emphasized is that ancient cultures believed that fear of death corrupted judgment. They structured narratives to minimize fear. End-phase accounts are calm. This calm preserves clarity. Another factor is that survival narratives encourage projection into the future. Ancient cultures focused on continuity across generations, not individual futures. The future belonged to the cycle, not the person. Another reason survival is rarely the focus is that ancient cultures valued balance over victory. Survival implies victory over threat. End-phase accounts emphasize balance restoration. Another subtle reason survival is not foregrounded is that ancient cultures believed that collapse was not failure, but correction. Survival narratives imply failure avoided. Correction narratives imply necessity fulfilled. This difference shapes tone. Another reason survival is rarely emphasized is that ancient cultures believed that existence was durable. The world did not end because some died. The cycle continued. Survival was assumed. What required explanation was transformation. Another factor is that survival narratives invite moral judgment of the dead. Ancient cultures avoided judging those lost in transition. They mourned without condemnation. Another reason survival is rarely central is that ancient cultures believed that suffering did not confer authority. Survival narratives often confer authority on survivors. Ancient texts resist this. Authority arises from alignment, not endurance. Another reason survival is not emphasized is that ancient cultures believed that fear distorted memory. They preserved memory through calm narration. Another subtle reason survival is rarely foregrounded is that ancient cultures believed that meaning persists beyond individual life. End-phase accounts reflect this belief. They focus on what continues, not who remains. This focus does not diminish human life, it situates it within continuity. As cycles close, survival becomes a background condition rather than a goal. Life continues because life always has. What matters is how that life is structured next. Ancient texts attend to that question. They leave survival implicit. They attend to orientation. They describe what changes, what remains functional, and what must be released. In doing so, they preserve continuity without promising rescue, endurance without drama, and meaning without fixation on who lived through the transition. Survival happens, but it's not the story. The story is what life becomes afterward. The quiet transition from observation to absence is one of the most understated yet consistent patterns in ancient end-phase accounts. It describes a shift that is not announced, not resisted, and rarely understood while it is happening. What changes is not the world itself, but the relationship between the world and those who once claimed to oversee, measure, or interpret it. Observation does not end abruptly, it thins. Presence does not vanish suddenly, it recedes. In the earliest records, gods are first described as watchers rather than rulers. They observe boundaries, movements, and balances. Their role is supervisory. Intervention occurs sparingly, usually when imbalance threatens to exceed tolerable limits. Observation, in this context, is a form of care. It implies attentiveness without constant interference. As cycles approach closure, this attentiveness changes. The texts do not describe conflict or rebellion in the heavens. They describe distance. Omens become less specific. Divine responses become delayed or indirect. Communication grows ambiguous. These are not signs of hostility. They are signs of withdrawal. Withdrawal does not imply abandonment. It implies that the conditions requiring close observation no longer exist, or that continued observation would prevent necessary adjustment. The system must be allowed to respond on its own. This transition mirrors human behavior during periods of maturation or decline. A guardian who never steps back prevents growth. A ruler who never releases control creates dependency. Ancient cosmology applied this logic universally. Observation, therefore, was temporary by design. The texts imply that close divine observation belonged to periods of formation and stabilization. When humanity required guidance to establish order, observation was intense. When systems matured, observation became less necessary. As cycles closed, that maturity reached its limits. Continued observation would not restore balance. It would sustain obsolete structures. This is why observation transitions into absence rather than into punishment. Absence, in this sense, is functional. It removes reinforcement from systems that must dissolve. The absence described in ancient texts is subtle. It appears as unanswered rituals, delayed omens, or silence where guidance once existed. It does not arrive with declaration. It becomes noticeable only when expectation persists. This persistence of expectation is key. The absence is felt because habits continue. Rituals are performed. Appeals are made. When response does not follow, awareness shifts. This delayed recognition prevents panic. It forces gradual adaptation. Ancient cultures did not interpret absence immediately as loss. They tested it. They repeated actions. They waited. Only over time did patterns of non-response become clear. This patience reflects trust in continuity. If absence were interpreted instantly as catastrophe, collapse would accelerate. Instead, societies adjusted incrementally. Observation also fades unevenly. Some domains retain signs longer than others. A city may still experience omens while another does not. A ruler may feel divine sanction, while another feels uncertainty. This unevenness prevents uniform collapse. It staggers transition. Ancient texts record this unevenness implicitly. They note confusion, competing interpretations, and regional variation. These inconsistencies are not errors. They are features of withdrawal. Absence, therefore, does not mean emptiness. It means decentralization. Authority once concentrated disperses. Interpretation once unified fragments. Responsibility shifts downward. This redistribution is one of the most significant consequences of observation ending. When divine oversight diminishes, human systems must compensate. Law replaces omen. Custom replaces command. Memory replaces instruction. This compensation is not smooth. Mistakes increase. Conflict arises. But learning accelerates. Ancient texts do not condemn this period. They describe it as necessary. The transition from observation to absence also affects knowledge production. Texts become more descriptive and less prescriptive. They record events rather than explain them. This shift marks a change in epistemology. Knowledge is no longer received. It is inferred. Inference requires caution. Claims narrow. Certainty fades. This epistemic humility is one of the most enduring legacies of cycle closure. The absence of observation also reshapes moral frameworks. Without constant oversight, behavior must be regulated internally. Conscience, law, and community norms become more important. This internalization of responsibility is a major developmental step. Ancient cultures did not frame it as loss. They framed it as burden. Burden implies weight, not abandonment. Another important aspect of this transition is that observation often continues symbolically, after it ends functionally. Gods remain named, temples remain active, ritual language persists, but the effect changes. This symbolic continuation cushions transition. It allows societies to adjust without sudden identity collapse. The texts reflect this by retaining divine names even as divine action recedes. Later readers often mistake this for decline in belief. In reality, belief persists, function changes. The quiet nature of this transition also protects social cohesion. Sudden declarations of absence would fracture trust. Quiet fading allows reinterpretation. Different groups explain absence differently. Some attribute it to human failure, others to divine will, others to mystery. This interpretive diversity prevents single-point failure. Ancient texts tolerate this ambiguity. They do not enforce uniform explanation. Another consequence of absence is innovation. Without observation enforcing tradition, experimentation becomes possible. Some innovations fail, others succeed. Ancient records do not judge innovation harshly, they record outcomes. This openness is only possible when observation withdraws. If oversight remained constant, deviation would be punished. Absence creates freedom. Freedom creates risk. Risk creates learning. This sequence underlies transition. The transition from observation to absence also reshapes time perception. Without omens to mark significance, time feels flatter. Events lose cosmic framing. This flattening is often described as disenchantment. Ancient texts do not mourn it explicitly. They adapt. Adaptation involves new markers. Political milestones replace celestial ones. Legal reforms replace ritual cycles. The world becomes more human-centered but not autonomous. The sky remains. It simply no longer speaks in the same way. Ancient cultures did not interpret this silence as indifference. They interpreted it as distance. Distance allowed perspective. Perspective allowed reflection. Reflection allowed restructuring. This progression is subtle and slow. It does not produce dramatic narratives. It produces administrative records, laws, and chronicles. The change in textual genre itself reflects the transition. Myth gives way to record. This shift has been misread as loss of imagination. It is better understood as change in function. When observation ended, explanation became less metaphysical and more practical. Another important feature of this transition is that absence is rarely complete. It is partial and conditional. Certain moments still produce signs. Certain rituals still resonate. This residual presence maintains connection. It prevents despair. The ancient worldview did not require total absence to justify transition. Partial absence was sufficient. The quiet nature of this process also explains why later generations often believe the gods abandoned humanity suddenly. They inherit the outcome without experiencing the transition. From their perspective, absence appears total. Ancient texts written closer to the transition reveal its gradual nature. This discrepancy produces myth. Myth simplifies gradual change into narrative events. The quiet transition from observation to absence is therefore a source of later misunderstanding. It lacks spectacle. It resists summary. It unfolds through small changes that accumulate. This accumulation mirrors other end-phase processes. Observation does not end because the world fails. It ends because observation is no longer the appropriate response. Absence allows systems to reveal their capacity. Those that endure do so without supervision. Those that collapse reveal dependency. Ancient cultures accepted this testing. They did not demand reassurance. They adapted. This adaptation reshaped authority, knowledge, and identity. It also reshaped humanity's relationship with meaning. Meaning became something constructed rather than received. This shift is profound. It marks a threshold between cosmologies. The ancient texts do not celebrate this threshold. They record it. They do so quietly. The absence of declaration is itself a clue. No god announces departure. No oracle proclaims silence. The transition is recognized only through effect. Rituals feel hollow. Authority weakens. Interpretation fragments. These are the signs. They are not dramatic. They are cumulative. The quiet transition from observation to absence therefore does not mark the end of guidance. It marks the beginning of responsibility. Responsibility is heavier than command. It cannot be delegated. Ancient cultures understood this weight. They did not rush to name the transition. They lived into it. As cycles closed, observation faded not because it failed, but because it had done its work. Absence was not neglect. It was release. And within that release, humanity entered a phase where meaning had to be carried forward without constant confirmation, guided by memory, restraint, and the quiet recognition that what once watched no longer needed to, because the system itself was expected to continue, altered but intact, into whatever configuration followed next. When the sky stops being watched, what remains is not emptiness, confusion, or abandonment. What remains is habit, structure, and a quiet inheritance of orientation that no longer depends on constant observation. The absence of watchers does not erase the sky's presence. It changes how that presence is integrated into daily life. Ancient texts suggest that when celestial observation loses its central authority, the sky does not disappear from human concern. It becomes background rather than instruction. It continues to mark time through day and night, season and weather, but it no longer dictates meaning moment by moment. This shift is subtle, and it is often misunderstood as loss. In reality, it represents internalization. What was once read explicitly is absorbed implicitly. The first thing that remains is rhythm. Even when the sky is no longer watched with interpretive intensity, its cycles continue to structure existence. The sun still rises. The moon still waxes and wanes. Seasons still turn. Agriculture still depends on these rhythms, even if their symbolic interpretation fades. Rhythm does not require belief. It requires repetition. Ancient cultures recognized that rhythm was more durable than explanation. When explanation failed or withdrew, rhythm carried continuity forward. This is why calendars persist even when cosmologies change. Names of months may shift, festivals may lose original meaning, but the division of time remains. Work, rest, planting and harvest still follow patterns rooted in the sky. The sky stops being watched, but it does not stop being lived under. Another thing that remains is orientation. Even without omens or divine messages, humans still locate themselves spatially and temporally using celestial reference points. East and west remain meaningful. Dawn and dusk still structure movement. Navigation continues. This practical orientation survives collapse more reliably than symbolic interpretation. Ancient texts imply that this grounding prevents disorientation during transition. When authority weakens and explanation fragments, orientation stabilizes. You may not know why things are changing, but you still know where you are and when you are. This grounding matters. What also remains is memory embedded in practice. Rituals continue, though their interpretation changes. People still mark solstices, equinoxes, and seasonal transitions, even when the cosmology that once explained them fades. The act survives because it works. It gathers community. It marks time. It creates continuity. Meaning adjusts around the act rather than the act disappearing. This adaptability is central. When the sky stops being watched as a source of instruction, it remains as a source of cohesion. Another enduring element is language shaped by long observation. Words like season, cycle, return, and balance persist, even when their original cosmological framework dissolves. These words carry compressed memory. They remind societies that change follows pattern. Language preserves this intuition quietly. Ancient texts suggest that when divine observation recedes, metaphor increases. The sky becomes less a message and more a reference. People speak of time as weather, of fortune as seasons, of decline as winter. These metaphors are not decorative. They are functional. They allow people to think cyclically without needing doctrine. What remains is also restraint. Without constant signs prompting action, people become cautious. Decisions rely more on precedent and experience than on interpretation of omens. This restraint slows reaction. It reduces volatility. Ancient cultures appear to have valued this slowdown during transition. It prevented overcorrection. Another thing that remains is law. As celestial authority fades, legal authority strengthens. Written codes replace interpreted signs. Procedure replaces divination. This shift is not framed as progress or decline. It is adaptation. Law persists because it provides predictability without requiring constant interpretation. When the sky stops being watched, predictability must come from elsewhere. Law fills that role. What also remains is craftsmanship. Skills persist independent of cosmology. Stone is still shaped. Metal is still worked. Textiles are still woven. These skills are anchored in material reality. They survive shifts in belief. Ancient texts imply that practical knowledge often outlasts theoretical frameworks. This survival is crucial. It allows societies to rebuild even when guidance feels distant. Another enduring element is story. Even when gods withdraw and omens fade, stories continue to be told. Their tone changes. Myth becomes legend. Legend becomes history. But narrative persists. Narrative organizes memory. It helps people situate themselves within time even when cosmic markers no longer speak. Stories carry orientation forward. Another thing that remains is community memory. Elders still teach. Families still transmit habits. Place-based knowledge persists. This local memory becomes more important when centralized interpretation fades. Ancient texts often shift focus from universal cosmology to regional record during these periods. This reflects decentralization. What remains is also humility. When the sky stops being watched, certainty diminishes. People rely less on absolute explanations. This uncertainty is not framed as failure. It is framed as condition. Ancient cultures appear to have accepted this condition. Acceptance reduces fear. Another element that remains is silence itself. Silence becomes familiar rather than alarming. People adjust to not receiving answers. This adjustment changes expectation. When expectation lowers, resilience increases. The sky no longer needs to speak because people no longer demand speech. This shift stabilizes transition. What remains is also the capacity to reinterpret. Without fixed interpretation enforced by celestial signs, meaning becomes flexible. This flexibility allows adaptation. Ancient texts suggest that this period produces new symbolic systems. Philosophy emerges. Ethics shifts. Political theory develops. These developments arise because space opens. The absence of watchers creates room. What remains as well is the sense of limit. Without divine oversight, excess becomes more dangerous. Communities learn through consequence rather than warning. This learning is slower, but it is durable. Ancient cultures appear to have accepted that some lessons could only be learned this way. What also remains is grief. Loss is acknowledged. Temples decay. Rituals lose potency. Lamentations are composed. Grief preserves memory of what mattered. It prevents denial. Ancient texts do not suppress grief during these periods. They integrate it. Another enduring element is the sky itself as backdrop. Even unwatched, it remains vast, regular, and indifferent. This indifference is not hostile. It is stabilizing. The sky does not react to human confusion. It continues. This continuation reassures. What remains is also the idea of return, even if undefined. People may no longer expect messages from the sky, but they still expect cycles to turn. Day follows night. This expectation anchors hope without requiring prophecy. Ancient texts imply that this quiet expectation replaces explicit belief. Another thing that remains is memory of watching. People remember that the sky was once watched differently. This memory influences future curiosity. Later, cultures revive astronomy. Observation returns in new forms. The sky stops being watched in one way, not forever. This recurrence reflects cyclical inheritance. Another element that remains is caution toward authority. When divine oversight fades, people become wary of claims to absolute power. This wariness shapes political development. Checks emerge. Ancient texts suggest that the withdrawal of watchers contributes to skepticism. Skepticism is not disbelief, it is restraint. Another thing that remains is the practice of recording. Chronicles replace omens, history replaces myth. This shift preserves continuity. Even when meaning thins, record remains. Record allows later reflection. What also remains is the sense that something has changed, even if it cannot be named. This vague awareness permeates texts written after transition. They speak of decline, of distance, of loss of clarity. This awareness shapes culture. It produces nostalgia, reform movements, and revival attempts. These responses are part of adaptation. Another enduring element is the threshold itself. The moment when watching stops becomes a reference point. Later cultures look back and say things were different then. This perception may be vague, but it is powerful. It creates eras. Eras organize memory. What remains is not instruction, but orientation. Orientation allows movement without guidance. Ancient texts suggest that this capacity marks maturation. Humanity is no longer guided moment by moment. It must rely on inherited structure. This reliance is risky, but it is necessary. What remains when the sky stops being watched is therefore not loss, but responsibility. Responsibility for timing. Responsibility for restraint. Responsibility for memory. The sky's silence transfers weight downward. This transfer is heavy. Ancient cultures did not celebrate it. They endured it. Another thing that remains is adaptability under uncertainty. Without signs, people experiment. Some experiments fail, others succeed. This process produces diversity. Diversity increases resilience. Ancient texts imply that monoculture was dangerous. Withdrawal of watchers breaks uniformity. This fragmentation can be painful, but it prevents total collapse. Another element that remains is the capacity for meaning-making. Without external confirmation, humans generate meaning internally. This generation can distort. It can also innovate. Ancient cultures accepted both outcomes. They did not attempt to control interpretation fully. What remains is the sky as measure rather than message. It still measures time, but it does not explain it. This distinction is crucial. Measure stabilizes, message agitates. When cycles close, agitation must decrease. The sky's silence accomplishes this. Another thing that remains is the humility to accept not knowing. Ancient texts model this acceptance. They leave gaps. They resist closure. This openness allows continuity. Finally, what remains when the sky stops being watched is the cycle itself. Cycles do not require watchers to continue. They require only conditions. The sky does not need interpretation to turn. Life does not need explanation to persist. What remains is life lived within rhythm rather than under instruction. This shift defines the end phase not as loss of guidance, but as transition of guidance. Guidance moves from above to within, from sign to habit, from declaration to pattern. The sky stops being watched, not because it has nothing left to say, but because what needed to be learned from watching has already been absorbed into behavior, memory, and structure. What remains is quieter. It is less dramatic, but it is sufficient. And in that sufficiency, the next configuration begins to form, guided not by voices from above, but by inherited rhythms, restrained choices, and the quiet understanding that even unwatched, the sky continues to turn, carrying time forward without announcement, as it always has. There is a particular kind of ending that does not announce itself, does not interrupt routines, and does not demand acknowledgement. It arrives quietly, settles into place, and becomes visible only later, when memory begins to compare what once felt certain with what now feels ordinary. Ancient texts leave space for this kind of ending because it was the one they expected most often. If a cycle ends without being noticed, it does not mean nothing changed. It means change occurred at a scale and pace that did not trigger alarm. Life continued. Work was done. Seasons turned. Children were born into conditions that felt stable to them, even if those conditions differed subtly from what came before. The absence of recognition did not prevent transition, it enabled it. Ancient cultures understood that the most durable transformations were those that did not provoke resistance. Sudden endings invite reaction. Quiet endings invite adjustment. When nothing appears to break, nothing needs to be defended. Old structures are not torn down, they simply stop being used in the same way. This is why so many ancient records describe decline indirectly. They speak of thinning presence, fading certainty, and altered emphasis rather than collapse. The cycle does not end with a moment. It ends with a shift in relevance. What once required attention no longer does. What once demanded explanation becomes habit. What once felt central becomes peripheral. These changes are difficult to notice while they are happening because they do not violate expectation. They reshape it. A cycle ending without notice suggests that its logic has already been absorbed. The behaviours it enforced have become internal. The boundaries it maintained no longer require supervision. The lessons it imposed have either been learned or become irrelevant. Ancient texts imply that this is the preferred outcome. A cycle that ends quietly has fulfilled its function. It does not need to announce departure because nothing depends on its continued presence. The danger in this framework is not that a cycle ends unnoticed. The danger is that it ends loudly. Loud endings indicate resistance, imbalance, and excess. Quiet endings indicate alignment. Alignment does not require awareness. It requires adaptation. When a cycle ends without being noticed, people do not grieve it. They do not mark it. They do not record it as an ending. They live into what follows without naming it. Later generations may look back and identify a boundary, but those living through it rarely do. This delayed recognition is not failure of perception. It is a feature of continuity. Ancient cultures accepted that meaning often emerges after experience, not before. They did not expect to understand transition in the moment. They expected understanding to arrive later, shaped by consequence. This expectation allowed them to endure ambiguity without anxiety. If the cycle ends without notice, rituals may continue, but their weight changes. They become commemorative rather than directive. They anchor memory rather than command behavior. This transformation happens quietly. No decree announces it. Authority may persist, but it feels different. Commands still issue. Structures still exist. But their force depends more on habit than on belief. This thinning of authority does not provoke rebellion immediately. It simply reduces urgency. Over time, new forms emerge alongside old ones. The old fade without being destroyed. The new settle in without needing permission. Ancient texts often capture this overlap rather than the boundary. They show old gods named alongside new ones, old laws cited alongside revised practices. This coexistence marks transition more clearly than rupture ever could. If the cycle ends without being noticed, it suggests that its constraints were no longer necessary. People behave differently without realizing why. Excess becomes less attractive. Simplicity becomes preferable. Restraint feels natural rather than imposed. This internalization is the sign of completion. Cycles exist to regulate behavior. When regulation becomes unnecessary, the cycle dissolves into background. The sky no longer needs to be watched because its lessons have been absorbed into rhythm. The gods no longer need to intervene because intervention would only preserve obsolete forms. Authority no longer needs to assert itself because obedience is no longer central. What replaces these is not freedom without structure, but structure without spectacle. Ancient texts do not celebrate this condition. They describe it neutrally. It is not triumph. It is not loss. It is sufficiency. Sufficiency is difficult to narrate. It lacks drama. It does not provoke emotion. It is noticed only in hindsight. This is why the quiet ending of a cycle is often invisible in the record. It leaves no ruins. It leaves no scars. It leaves only altered assumptions. Later generations may sense that something changed long ago without knowing exactly when. They may speak of distance, of loss of clarity, of a time when things were different. These impressions are vague because the ending was not an event, it was a settling. Ancient cultures did not fear this settling, they feared imbalance. A quiet ending signalled that imbalance had been resolved without excess damage. The absence of notice also protects continuity. When people do not perceive an ending, they do not abandon effort. They continue to build, teach, and remember. This continuity carries forward what remains functional. If people were told explicitly that a cycle had ended, they might stop maintaining structures that still had use. Quiet endings prevent premature abandonment. Ancient texts preserve this logic by refusing final declarations. They do not mark the end of cycles with certainty. They leave space. That space allows continuation. A cycle ending without notice also preserves dignity. There is no humiliation in quiet transition. No one is proven wrong. No authority is publicly exposed as obsolete. This discretion reduces conflict. Discretion matters during transition. Ancient societies experienced enough disruption from environment, conflict, and scarcity. They did not add unnecessary strain by dramatizing endings. The quiet ending of a cycle also preserves memory more effectively. Memory fades gradually rather than being severed. Practices transform slowly. Language adapts. Nothing is forced to disappear overnight. This gradual transformation allows inheritance without rupture. If the cycle ends without us noticing, it may be because noticing is not required. The work of the cycle is done. What needed correction has been corrected. What needed limitation has been imposed. What needed preservation has been preserved. The cycle does not need acknowledgement to end. It ends because its conditions no longer exist. Ancient texts imply that this is the most stable outcome. It produces the least resistance. It leaves the fewest wounds. The cost of such an ending is ambiguity. People may feel that something is missing without knowing what. They may seek explanation where none is available. This search produces myth, philosophy, and speculation. These responses are not failures, they are expressions of adaptation. Later cultures may reinterpret quiet endings as losses or betrayals. They may imagine a moment when guidance was withdrawn suddenly. These interpretations reflect distance from the transition, not the transition itself. Those living through a quiet ending rarely feel abandoned. They feel unsettled, then accustomed. The ancient worldview allowed for this process without panic. This perspective is difficult to maintain in cultures that expect clarity and closure. It requires tolerance for uncertainty. Ancient texts model this tolerance by leaving things unresolved. They do not tell the listener that a cycle has ended. They let the listener infer it over time. This inference builds resilience. If the cycle ends without notice, it suggests that the next configuration is already forming. New patterns emerge before old ones disappear. This overlap ensures continuity. The ancient texts imply that endings and beginnings coexist. There is no empty space between them. Quiet endings compress this overlap. They allow beginnings to arrive unnoticed as well. This continuity reduces shock. Shock destabilizes memory. Quiet endings preserve it. Another implication of an unnoticed ending is that responsibility shifts gradually. No one is suddenly accountable for managing a new world. Responsibility diffuses. Diffusion allows learning. Ancient cultures valued this diffusion. It prevented concentration of power during uncertainty. The quiet ending of a cycle also prevents fixation on the past. When there is no clear boundary, nostalgia lacks an anchor. People adapt rather than cling. This adaptability is crucial. If the cycle ended loudly, memory might freeze around that moment. Quiet endings allow memory to evolve. Ancient texts preserve this evolution by remaining open-ended. They do not close narratives. They allow continuation. This open-endedness is intentional. It reflects trust in continuity rather than fear of loss. If the cycle ends without us noticing, it may be because we were never meant to witness endings as events. We were meant to live through transitions as conditions. Ancient cultures accepted this limitation. They did not demand spectacle from reality. They trusted pattern over moment. This trust allowed them to endure repeated transitions without despair. The quiet thought that remains is not one of fear or urgency. It is one of perspective. If a cycle ends quietly, it suggests that life has adjusted smoothly enough to carry forward without interruption. This is not insignificant. It is success. Success in ancient terms did not mean preservation of form. It meant preservation of function. The cycle does not owe us recognition. It does not need our awareness to conclude. Its work is structural, not performative. If it ends without notice, it may be because noticing is a luxury reserved for hindsight. Those who come later will identify boundaries and name errors. Those living through transitions simply live. Ancient texts honour this simplicity. They do not insist on awareness. They do not demand comprehension. They allow continuity to do its work quietly. And in that quiet, without declaration, without spectacle, without finality, the cycle dissolves into habit, memory and structure, leaving behind a world that feels familiar enough to inhabit, altered enough to endure, and stable enough to carry time forward into whatever configuration follows, without ever requiring that anyone stop, look up, and realize that something has already gently come to an end.